Okay. Yeah. Today just doing a kind of casual video here. Um Forgive, I suppose you could say, the technical quality of this video just because right now I'm running into that weird thing with Windows 11 where when you try to plug in like a camera and audio, like the camera blocks the audio devices. It's so weird. I tried disabling drivers and stuff. It's strange, but the mic quality should be pretty good. The camera quality is not as good as I'd hoped, but it's whatever. Um, Regardless, so this stream is just kind of a pretty casual, relaxed stream. I have some time today, and I thought I'd do this, and I'd been meaning to do this exact topic for a little while now. Basically, I just want to give what I consider to be the most important works to read if you want to be a really solid um, theologian, philosopher of the scholastic tradition, especially Lutheran, of course. Because when we talk about like, oh yeah, we just have a ton of access to various works. We read a lot, we talk a lot about this stuff. A lot of, I think there's an impression that's like, oh, I just have access to stuff that's super expensive and nobody can read like anything that I've ever read or any of us have ever read. And that's just not the case. Like we have a bunch of stuff in there um that is, you know, practically public domain that you can get access to. So in today's video, I'm going to give, my recommendations both for philosophy and theology um, that I'd say that pretty much everybody should read. Most of them are going to be public domain or free online somehow. Um, and some of them are obviously going to be expensive, but they're worth it in my mind. So the point of this stream is not saying like if you haven't read this stuff, you don't know what you're talking about, or like if you haven't read this, you're not a good theologian or philosopher. That's not the point. The point is more so if you've read like all of this stuff, you're like really well set up. And if you have the time, read at least some of this stuff. So I am going to start sharing my screen um, where I have it. Okay. Yeah. So I am sharing my screen. I'm going to zoom in just so it's more visible here. At least where I'm looking, it's not the best, most obvious looking. All right. There we go. So these are the books that I would say I would recommend for people to read if they want to become a solid scholastic theologian or philosopher of the Lutheran tradition specifically. Um, and I'm going to go from, the essentials through patristics through philosophy and theology. I'm going to explain the works in some degree of detail. Some of these works are ones that I didn't add up near. These are things that like Seth or Cameron or one of the other contributors did. So if you see something, or if I say something like, "Hey, I haven't read this," that's not because I just put it up there randomly. It's because somebody else put it up there, and I'll say that. I just don't want to cover a topic that I've just not read at all and say like, "Yeah, I know what I'm talking about," when I actually don't. Also, you're probably gonna see a bunch of books or think of a bunch of books that aren't up here, and, yeah, I mean, I can't cover everything, and a lot of these are just things I recommend, like, when we get into the patristics, for example, there's stuff that you could totally read that I would actually recommend, like, I don't have on here, for example, anything from Clement of Alexandria, but I'd still recommend his Stromata to some extent. There's a lot more stuff, like, I would recommend Tertullian's Against Praxeas, but I don't have that up here. So, yeah, and then what's bold is stuff that, like, I especially recommend. I say, "Hey, like, you should really, really read this stuff." Um, and so, yeah, let's begin. And in the middle of this, if you guys wanna send, like, questions in, you can. This isn't like a formal Q&A, so to speak. But, as we're going through it, this is pretty relaxed, pretty chill, so if you have any questions, just let me know. It can have to do with this video, doesn't have to. It can be really about anything theology or philosophy, and I'll try to answer it as best I can, or I'll just say, like, "I don't know." So, yeah, this is pretty chill. And then, yeah, hi, Euler's pupil. I swear, I hope I get credit for being able to pronounce his name correctly. And then can everybody hear me? I hope you guys can. I tested the mic, but I'm not just like rambling with no audio. Um, yeah. So I'm gonna start off here. The absolute essentials, Bible, Apocrypha, Book of Concord. So I feel like this should be fairly obvious. The Bible, yeah. I mean, you should be reading this pretty much constantly. Like you can never read the Bible enough. Like there's never going to be a time it's like, yeah, I've read it. I don't need to do it anymore. You should constantly be reading it. I mentioned in another video that I've made that the way I do it is I read, I think something like, yeah, I read like Old Testament history or prophet. So minus the Psalms. So basically the Old Testament minus the Psalms, Book of Job, Song of Songs, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. So I read one chapter of any Old Testament book other than that. And then I read a chapter of one of those books that I said I don't, it's not in the history of prophet section. So something from Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, or what am I missing? I know I said Psalms, but there's Job. Yeah, so I'm in Job right now. And then I read a psalm separately. I also read a chapter of the Apocrypha, and then I read New Testament epistle, and then Gospel. So a chapter from each of those things that I recommended. Not everybody has the time to do that. It's just for my sake. I have that kind of memory, and I have that ability to do it. So I really do, and it helps me remember things more. I think I mentioned in that video I made that was a scripted one, how like I don't recommend people just read one book at a time because when you do that, what often happens is you'll just be stuck. I know people, for example, who would go, they're like, I'm going to spend like 2 years reading the prophets. And so like they'll just forget parts of the gospels and the epistles, which is like, you should probably know that stuff. I think it's a good idea to remember that. So I think it's a better idea to read from multiple different sections. And it reminds me of, the structure of the liturgy, um, wherein like, oh, and Seth just joined us. Hey, Seth, can you hear me? Oh, he may take a second. Well, he's muted, but let's see. Regardless, I'll keep going. Seth, at any time, feel free to interject or feel free to say something or answer it. Um, so yeah. So yeah, I said the Bible. Yeah, read as I said. I say the Apocrypha as well. Seth is going to know more about the Apocrypha than I will. This is actually my first time around through it. Um, I've never read through the Apocrypha before this. I've read through Judith, Tobit. Oh, yeah. Seth, can you hear me? I see you now.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I just wanna make sure that people can hear me. Um, yeah, so I actually do recommend that people read from the Apocrypha every day. Like, Steph, you know more about the Apocrypha than I do. I mean, so what do you think is a good use of the Apocrypha? Like, I bet you read it a lot. How do you use it?
Um, I mean, it's mostly used in the liturgy just for propers. Like a lot of the introits and graduals and things like that are from the Apocrypha. But I think Sirach in general is really helpful just as practical advice. It's like Proverbs, but even more practical. Like it's a more specific, like down to earth examples of pretty much like how to apply Proverbs.
Mhm,
Um, and the 1 to 4 Maccabees are pretty useful in connecting the Testament in terms of historical like
mhm.
notes.
Yeah,
I'm ironing,
and
by
I
the way.
and our own Lutheran fathers, like, cite the Apocrypha, not as, like, establishing evidence, but kinda supporting evidence of some kind.
Yeah, it's
At the very least, you should treat the Apocrypha kind of analogous to church fathers, at the very least.
yeah, that's a good way to put it.
There's a guy that comments, no name, that's his actual name. Any commentaries for Apocrypha? I mean, I have the Lutheran Apocrypha, like, that
Yeah,
actually is pretty
Lutheran
good.
Apocrypha is pretty good.
Yeah.
So if you take a high view of the Apocrypha, the Lutheran edition will come off as a low view.
Yeah.
Um, but if you take kind of the more common, like it's very much like the common Lutheran position you hear today, which treats it a little lower. Um, but it's pretty good in general. I
Yeah.
like that edition.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I don't know of any specific commentaries that I recommend. I mean, I
There's
imagine there are gonna be some from, like, Catholics, but
Yeah, there are Catholic
and
ones.
Orthodox, of course.
If you're fine with like kind of like mainstream like liberal commentaries that are still useful just for historical like and grammatical analysis and things like that, the Anchor Bible
Mm,
commentary series has
mhm.
editions. And then there's also the Ancient Christian Commentary series has one volume on the Apocrypha.
Oh, really? I didn't know
So
that.
yeah.
And then Euler says, quote, "I blame Quinstead." Do you blame Quinstead with respect to the non-use of the Apocrypha? Um,
Um, I don't
I
think
don't
so.
know.
I could be
I
wrong.
blame Gerhard more than anybody.
Gerhard.
Gerhard uses it, but, like, he obviously spends a lot of time
Yeah,
going
Gerhard.
after it.
Well, Chemnitz takes So interpreting Chemnitz is a little weird. He puts the
Oh, he's
Apocrypha and the
not.
New Testament Antilegomena in the same category, which is really,
Yeah,
really weird. Like that's
yeah,
nobody else does that.
yeah.
So that's a weird take. I have a higher view than Gerhard does, but
Hmm.
I don't know who to blame really. I mean, like Valerius Herberger wrote an entire sermon series on Sirach. Uh,
I actually didn't know that.
so he's not to blame, definitely. Yeah, I was like, it's a 97 sermons, I believe. So like a
Oh
whole ton.
wow.
Yeah, like two
Yeah.
per chapter practically.
Yeah, well, so moving on, I also have another absolute essential. I have the Book of Concord, of course. This is one that, like, I'm not saying you have to read it like every single day. I've read through it twice. But like to understand Lutheranism, like if that's your goal, you should definitely read the Book of Concord. I mean, before you're reading like pretty much anything else of Lutheranism, like just straight read the Book of Concord. This is what I say. I mean, some parts are more advanced than others, and it's obviously a very big book, but it's not like every single page is new doctrine compared to the last. It's not like page 1 says X, page 2 says Y, page 3 says Z. Now, like you have a lot of repetition of doctrines and like further clarifications of it. Um, yeah. So yeah, Seth Euler's people said that if he remembers correctly, Quenstedt had a lower view of the Apocrypha than Kalov. Yeah, that I have no clue what Kalov had view on the
I
Apocrypha
don't know
either.
either.
So like, yeah,
I
I
checked
would.
on Joyce in the Inspiration of Scripture volume, but I don't remember like the details. Um, but except there's definitely some notes in there at least. But that's what I got.
Yeah, I just don't know. I wish we had more Kalov translated and like Euler's people. You know more about Quenstedt and Kalov than I at least I do. I've read my a fair share of Quenstedt. He's so dry, but like I've read him, so
Yeah, be a
I
little more
guess that's
Quincy
the
in
thing I missed.
English. He's really dry though.
Oh, he is so dry. It's
He's way
painful.
more dry than like Gerhard or Chemnitz, which are pretty interesting.
Yeah, Chemnitz is very interesting. Gerhard's a little drier.
Yeah,
Quenstedt's
Gerhard's a
very
little
dry.
drier.
Yeah,
He's more well organized though, so if he's better for
yeah,
reference.
yeah. I can respect that. Yeah, or as people, what do you read him in then? You read mostly Caleb. Do you read Latin? Like
Yeah,
what?
he's translating Kalov's metaphysics.
I love you. No, that's actually like really important because one of my if Euler's people, if you can like ever summarize his metaphysics for me, please do that. Like if before you finish translating, because I have You know, I have one of my next videos I want to make is on, of course, on metaphysics, part of the scholasticism series. And I really, haven't found anything explicit that's like, hey, these are what the Lutherans think of metaphysics. Like explicitly, just this Lutheran says this is the formal object of metaphysics or anything like that. I'm not expecting Quentz to go that far per se. It'd be nice if he did, but I just don't see anything on the level of like Aquinas, Scotus, Occam, Bonaventure, where they're just explicitly saying this is the job of metaphysics. This is how we use it. A lot of it is more just don't use metaphysics too much, as opposed to this is how we should use it and this is where it's good, and even establishing metaphysical concepts. So I would love that, honestly, but take your time on it. Obviously, like if you can't get to me on that, I get it. But please, yeah, if you're able to translate that, I mean, we'd be promoting it on this channel for sure. We'd love that. So yeah. Um anything you want to say on the Book of Concord, Seth, regarding how important it is? I mean, I feel like it's fairly obvious.
Um, the historical doctrine introductions by Bente are really good.
Okay.
So you can get those from CPH. They're also available for free on like the bookofconcord.org. Um, yeah, the reader's edition is good. Depending on which edition you want, there's reader's edition, there's Tapper, there's a Cole Boenger, bunch of different editions. There's also just translations of like certain parts of it by different people. So I like the reader's edition, and I also like the Triglot personally. Um, Cole Boenger is the more academic edition. I don't really use it as much though, personally.
Yeah. Yeah, I use the reader's edition, and I've had people like that I've recommended, they'll ask me, what should I use when they're first getting into theology? Like, there's a guy at my church who he's really just trying to get more into theology. Like he obviously believes Lutheranism, but he's really looking to understand what are our core doctrines like further, because he's read the small catechism, he's getting into the large catechism, the Augsburg Confession, and I gave him the reader's edition, or we had editions at our church. So he's been reading
Yeah,
it, and he said it's been really helpful.
the reader's
Um,
edition is the easiest one. It's like it's the most modern translation and the smoothest English translation in terms of like
yes.
readability. Um,
And
so
there's a lot of
sometimes
resources in it.
that mean it's not quite as word for word maybe as like the Triglot, but it's still a good translation. Um,
Yeah.
and it's more readable. So if you're just getting into things, it's probably the best edition to have. It has lots
Yeah,
of great notes.
agreed. Euler's people respond to this. He said that Kalov's metaphysics is like really distinct. It's quote an amalgamation of Suarez, Aquinas, Scotus, Kant, and Hegel. That's wild. I'd be so fascinated by that one.
Yeah, I knew he was eclectic. I knew he drew on Suarez and Scotus and Aquinas, but I didn't know about Kant or Hegel.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see how he draws on Kant and Hegel because, like, you have later like the critical Thomists, obviously, who draw on Kant. I haven't heard of too many, say, Thomists and Scholastics that draw on Hegel as much, but I'd be curious.
Yeah,
I'm not an expert in the incorporation of idealists into scholasticism. That's not my specialty. Again, I know the critical Thomists, but my understanding is they mostly just use Kant as opposed to Hegel. So I'd be so
yeah,
curious
and
to see
Leisler is
what.
critical of the Enlightenment philosophers in his Acta and Documenta Reformation or whatever it is, where
Hmm,
he's critiquing Wolff, who's
yeah.
a Roman Catholic who borrows more Enlightenment ideas, and he criticizes him for it.
Yeah. Yeah, he just comments, he says he basically predated insights by Kant and Hegel. Yeah, I'd be curious to see what they are. You don't need to give us a full rundown of everything because I know that's part of the translation that you're doing. And obviously, you got a lot of time. I'd love it in an email or something like that. Our email is just quite literally scholasticslutherans at Gmail because I might use that for a video, but like, you know, if no worries about it. Point is, well, yeah, I'd be curious to see what he predates. Like the main thing that I say Kant actually contributes is that the mind is active in the world. It's not purely passive as some of the rationalists kind of act like. It is very active. I wouldn't go as far as Kant as to say that it structures reality. Um, but nonetheless, I mean, he kind of is the basis of modern psychology, which is interesting. So
Yeah, he
yeah.
has some interesting ideas. Some things in him are useful.
Yeah. Moving on. So I'm gonna get into patristics. Now I think I mentioned this in the beginning of the stream. I put in bold the ones that I especially recommend where it's like if you can only read some of these, read the bold ones, you know, like just because. So I in my patristic stuff I have all the apostolic fathers, and then I said, okay, maybe not Shepherd of Hermas.
I
Uh
agree.
yeah,
He's not. He's if you're gonna skip any of them, skip Separate of Ramos.
yeah.
He's
You
really
would know more
long
than I
and
would. I've only read portions. But I know he's wild. Like
real wild.
yeah.
The one thing there is actually the Ask the Pastor video on Shepherd of Ramos, which came out
Yeah.
I don't know not that long ago, like a month ago or something maybe.
Okay.
Is actually quite good. And takes a more charitable interpretation of it. But yeah, it's a pretty long book and it's pretty moralistic.
Yeah.
And it's definitely it gets mixed reception in later
Makes
history.
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. But I said all apostolic fathers. What I would specifically say you should read, obviously, the Ignatian epistles, First Clement, Papias, Polycarp, and his martyrdom. Um, those are like the big ones I'd say that you should read. But I think the most important ones that I've encountered are going to be Ignatian epistles and First Clement. Like those are the huge ones that,
Those are the ones that people reference the most, definitely. Although I
yeah,
kind of think I like the Epistle to Diognetus the
yeah,
most.
yeah, that one too.
It's not very long either, and it's like I think it's I don't know if it's easy to understand. None of them are particularly difficult,
Hmm.
but that one is really good explanation of the gospel, frankly.
Yeah, it is. Um, so no name just commented. Is Origin one? No, he's not an apostolic father.
Yeah,
No, he's
yeah,
later. I also don't have Origin on this list, not because oh yeah, Didache as well. Correct. Yeah, read the
yeah. Oh,
Didache.
the Didache is also an essential one that's
Yeah.
frequently referenced in
Oh,
conversations.
obviously, yeah. Good
Yeah,
good catch, Centurion. Um, yeah, I didn't put Origin on here. So he's not an apostolic father, but I also didn't put Origin on here, not because I'm saying he's useless. I just quite literally have not read full works of his. So like I'm not gonna pretend, oh yeah, you gotta read him when I haven't read him. Like I'm
yeah. I don't know
sure,
if any of Origen's essential. On First Principles is his most famous work, which is like the first
yeah.
systematic theology. Um, his treatise on prayer is really good. I've read all of that. Against Celsus is pretty interesting for if you want like someone refuting like the big pagan name of the early church.
Hmm.
But I don't think any of Origin is essential in term. Given that we're Western
Yeah.
Christians, if we were
Yeah.
Easterners, I think it's really essential to understand Origin because he's so influential on the Christian East.
Yeah, makes sense. I also I put the first and second apologies by Justin Martyr. I had bolded the first apology. I think that one's a little more important than the second.
Yeah, it is.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think both are recommended. Justin Martyr obviously has some other good stuff. I've read his entire dialogue with Trifo. That's a really good one if you want to look into Christ fulfilling prophecies, and some Christological interpretations of the Old Testament. But I wouldn't say it's like necessary by any means. It's one I would say in theory you could kind of skip because a lot of other fathers just touch on the same things. But he has some interesting stuff in there. Like, I mean, he's gonna make statements in there about how like Christians are the true Israel and stuff like that. So that's pretty useful, especially from modern day. But there's not like that all over. And yeah, no name, you are right. Origin did a lot of allegorical interpretation. He totally did. Um, and there is some value in that. I just haven't read enough of him to say like, oh yeah, you should read X, Y, work X, work Y, work Z. I just don't know.
Yeah. We
Um,
only included works that we've read through, which is why some maybe works that people would expect might not be on the list simply because we
right.
haven't read through them. Like
Yeah.
we've probably read pieces of tons of works. Like I know I have. Like
Oh
I've
yeah,
read
same.
parts of loads of works, but I've never read straight through like Origins on First Principles, for example, which
Yeah.
is why it's like not on the list.
Yeah. Um, so I have Irenaeus is against heresies. I would recommend, of course, that you don't read like all of it because so much of it is just him, just like, hey, and this is what these really weird Gnostics believed, and it gets really confusing and stuff that you don't need to know at all. Like it doesn't establish his theology, and it's just completely ancient. Like there's value historically to it. Like there's historical value in that. Oh yeah, this is what he's refuting, but a lot of it is just him going against like the composition, the aeons, and the pleroma. It's just like what. So
Yeah,
it's
and if you're just trying to build your theological knowledge, it's you don't need to read all of those.
yeah. Let me
So
add, I forgot to add his
collections would be nice.
demonstration of apostolic preaching in here because that's what you really should read if you want to read Irenaeus.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Um,
that's the more readable document too.
yeah. Oh, and Centurion said, yeah, Saint Cyril of Jerusalem's catechetical lecture should 100% be on here. I want to be clear. Uh, that's a work I've been meaning to get to. That's a work that everybody recommends. I just haven't read it, and that's why I haven't put it on here. I pretty much can guarantee that when I do read it, if I were to come back here, I would put it on here. I would be like, yeah, 100%. Everybody says good things. Um, but like I just haven't put it on because I haven't read it. I can't say.
Yeah,
But
so I read sections of
everybody I
it.
read,
That's
everybody
it.
says it's good.
Yeah.
So, um, I also have so I can talk about this one probably more than you can. So I have Prescription Against Heretics by Tertullian.
Yeah, you
Um,
can do it.
yeah, so Prescription Against Heretics, it's pretty good because it shows just how Tertullian would deal with heretics. Like I was contemplating putting his against Marcion, against Praxius on here because those are really good too. But I think the best stuff when you see Tertullian working against heresy is going to be his prescription against heretics, and he goes through what the most relevant passages that people cite from Tertullian are from prescription against heretics. Chemnitz cites it a lot because that's Chemnitz. He goes through like what does it mean to have you know apostolic doctrine? Like what do you see when someone says this doctrine is not apostolic? And they cite Tertullian. This is where you're going to look. This is the book that has it, and I do think it's valuable. So
His
yeah,
Apology is
anything you want
probably
to
his
add?
most
There's
famous work. Any of his pre-Montanist works are worth reading. If
yeah,
you go on like Wikipedia, you'll see a list of the order of like the order in which they are written, roughly like an estimate.
yeah.
And any of them that are in the sure pre-Montanist category, which Prescription Against Heretics is, are good options.
Mhm. Centurion just commented there's a great revised edition of Against Heresies that trims many of the sections purely about Gnostic theology and leaves the expositions of Christian doctrine and mixed portions mostly untouched. Yeah, and he said that it made it Irenaeus wonderful to read. And if you have a link to that, like Amazon or something like that, yeah,
I'll
please
put that
drop
in
in the
chat.
chat.
I've seen that edition before.
I mean, I believe you. I'd like a link. That's what I should have done. That's like the one thing I was thinking to myself, I forgot to do something with this stuff. And then I realized I'm like, oh, I haven't put the links to these, but a lot of these you could just Google. A lot of them you can just straight up Google. So I won't add links, but I'd be curious to look at that myself. Um, the next work I have, this one is in bold, is On the Incarnation by St. Athanasius. I think that's pretty straightforward as to why it's super important. But I just recommend everybody read it. Like it's so good and it's really, really, really important for history, but you also learn a lot in it.
Yeah, I guess if
So
people don't know what that is, it's the pretty much the main treatise, probably the most famous treatise defending the divinity of Christ in the patristic era.
yep. Yeah. Um and
And,
like I have to be
and
honest, this is
explaining
gonna
like
sound
atonement and why God and why like the incarnation happens. It's also probably the
yes.
most important on those.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I have to be honest, a lot of the patristic works I just straight up read, and like I don't read them expecting to learn something in its own right. I expect to learn like what are the fathers, how did the fathers understand passages, as opposed to saying, yeah, I'm gonna expect to learn, the same amount about theology as I would reading something from Gerhard or even Luther, just because they weren't writing it systematically and they weren't touching on issues that, nowadays are as controversial. I mean, I guess they are, but like a lot of the works are like, dealing with pagans and such. And so like every once in a while you'll see a snippet that's really interesting, but a lot of it I don't expect to be like that, like super enlightening. But Athanasius is on the mysteries is very enlightening. Or not on the mystery, sorry, on the incarnation is very enlightening. So I do recommend it highly. That's why I have it in bold. Like it's arguably one of the most important, like top 10 most important writings in Christian history. So yeah. Next is Saint Ambrose. His both his On the Mysteries and On the Duties of the Clergy. On the Mysteries, it's very good in terms of theology. There's a guy in my church who named his son Ambrose because he was a Baptist and he was convinced of baptismal regeneration by Ambrose's arguments in On the Mysteries. So that's pretty significant. I think that shows. And then On the Duties of the Clergy is really good for the building of character and just sanctification in general. It's also one of his more famous works, from my understanding. It's really good. It's not like really, really doctrinal. It's more just honestly practical advice. And even though it's called On the Duties of the Clergy, I mean, everybody benefits from it. It's not him going through and like listing, what do you do in the liturgy? It's more him listing out things like, you need to be silent at the right times. This is practically just how do you live as a Christian. Um, it's very good in that respect.
Yep.
Um, yeah, I'd also recommend here. Um, Let me think. I'd also recommend some of his letters are really good, especially letters 70 through 80. Those ones are really interesting, or 75 through 85, something like that. Um, yeah, there you go. No name, you commented. I don't. Yeah, you questioned basically the possibility of the incarnation being rationally justifiable and possible in classical theism. If there are any recommendations for books that square things like absolute divine simplicity, divine immutability, and incarnation. I don't know if I have any books specifically that comment on that. I've read some. I don't know if I have them in this list, but I would recommend. Who was it? It wasn't Dominic Lega. There's a Thomist philosopher that wrote a book on it. Let me look what it is.
Yeah, we don't have any books in the list on that. But I'm trying to think.
I mean, the question basically becomes, how does Christ become man? Like, does that entail like a kind of composition or a changing in the nature of God? And I mean, if we follow the Athanasian Creed, we would say no, this isn't a changing in God. Really, this is the communication, of the attributes. Um, in some sense. Like there's the assumption of humanity, and we don't treat that to be the same as like a change in the divine nature. I would say Peter Lombard touches on this in the sentences, from my understanding. He touches on these kinds of questions.
Yep.
Aquinas is obviously going to touch on it. There are.
The
I don't know if I have a
scholastics touch
specific.
on it a lot. They're
Sorry.
a lot more concerned with that question. The scholastics in general is just like they are much more attuned to answering that type of question. Um, if I had to guess where you'd find it in the Church Fathers, it might be in maybe you could find some of that in the Cappadocians, touching on like immutability and the incarnation. I have not read enough of them to be able to answer that though.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a book that I would recommend. Yeah, it is Dominic Lega. So Dominic Lega had a book called The Trinitarian Christology of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, obviously, um, Roman Catholic Christology is going to be different than ours, but like Cameron, I have not read this book, but Cameron says it's one of his favorite books ever. He highly, highly recommends it. And I think it's going to be engaging these kinds of issues very well. I personally don't think that there's a specific issue that the incarnation has for classical theism. Or at least, there are the immediate issues on the face of it, but I ultimately don't think they're serious issues. I'd also recommend the work of a man named Tim Paul. So Tim, Tim. Pawl. He's a professor at University of St. Thomas here, where I live in the Twin Cities. So he's in St. Paul, and he's written books on this. So he wrote an analytic defense of conciliar Christology. So he touches on this kind of stuff. Well, how do you have immutability in Christ, and how do you talk about the two natures and so on? So he does some work on that. He's had some talks on it. So there's a great amount of work on it, no question. Um, but it's not something I read on way too much. I think if anything, you'll have to maybe search it, like, look it up, see if people have anything in, like, if you're in the Thomism discussion group or anything like that, people can help you with it. I had questions like this a few years ago, and I felt they were pretty well resolved by the people I talked to, but it's been a while since I've really done the research, so yeah, thanks for the question, though, that's a good one. I hope that was helpful in some way. Sorry that I don't have an immediate answer. And then
Another good
Centurion says
thing to
sorry,
reference on
Seth?
that. Another good thing to reference on that is Classical Theist has a video he did on I think it's just called "An Argument for Christianity," and it's about the uh, the nature of goodness being self-diffusive and how
Mhm.
it and he makes an argument for the incarnation um, based on that principle.
Yeah,
So that's a good video, like kind of making an argument for the incarnation from classical theism, which is pretty interesting.
yeah. Um, yeah, there was, Centurion, you made the right comment. I forgot about this one because I was gonna add this, like, I thought of it a while back, but I just forgot. Um, I can't remember how to spell his name, but I'll just leave it as that. But so yeah, we'll get back to that in a minute. The next I have Augustine. I mean, there's so much Augustine. I put his Confessions on the Trinity, and then I said some City of God. Um, there's more. I mean, Seth, haven't you read On the Spirit and the Letter or something like that? What was it that you
Yeah,
read as well?
I've read a bunch of Augustine. I've read On the Spirit and the Letter, a number of his small treatises um, on faith in the creed. I haven't quite finished City of God yet. I'm near the end. Um, Read the Confessions, of course. Yeah, so yeah, I'd recommend selections from City of God, maybe, unless you're really interested in it. It's pretty long. On the Trinity is pretty essential for Augustine.
Yeah. Well,
And
not
then,
only Augustine, it shapes the entire Western Trinitarian theology.
yeah, it really does. And the
So, like,
Confessions is
that's
obviously his
so
most famous
important.
work.
Yeah. What I would argue that his On the Trinity is probably um his most important work in terms of, like, well,
Yeah, it probably
I'd say it's at
is.
least his
The
magnum
Confessions
opus.
is the Confessions is like the famous one because it's way more readable,
Yeah,
and it's something they'd have you read in an undergrad class.
yeah.
um,
Yeah, I know people today who have read the Confessions in their, like, secular universities.
yeah,
Um, but I say On the Trinity is so important because it really does develop a lot of Trinitarian theology and, like, the terms that people use for it, so like one of the debates that you'll have in the medieval era is you'll have this question of how can we use Augustine's psychological analogy. So one of the comparisons that you'll have between, say, the Thomists and the Scotists on the Trinity is how they use the psychological analogy and what they think it entails. Like it's massive for Western Trinitarian theology. Obviously, Augustine, I believe he has some stuff in there. I don't know if he explicitly makes like these huge arguments for the filioque, but he affirms it. So there's a lot in there that's super valuable that I highly recommend. He's one of the I always cite when people ask me, well, why do we use the term person when we speak of the Trinity, like the individual persons? Augustine basically says in one of his chapters, like, we just don't have a better term. It's really difficult. Uh, it's like we just don't have a better term for it. Yeah, Centurion, you're kind of goaded here. You got a lot of good stuff here. You say I missed your Hippolytus on the apostolic tradition. Gregory of Nyssa's Great Catechism. Those are both, from what I understand, pretty good. I think I read Great Catechism a while back, but I don't recall
yeah,
too much of it. And then on the apostolic tradition, I just haven't read, so I can't say much. I can't really say
yeah.
anything. Sorry.
And there are a bunch of early ones we couldn't include,
Yeah.
but we had to be selective to a degree.
Yeah. And then On the Spirit and the Letter is, yeah, I would say it is one of the most quoted Augustinian works during the Reformation.
I really
I
like
mean,
that.
I see
I
it
really liked it.
constantly.
Really good.
Chemnitz cites it massively. Say it again, Seth.
I said I really like that one on the Spirit and Letter. It's really good.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Augustine is honestly like I hate saying this. I feel so mean when I say this, and people are gonna take this out of context and say like, oh, you think the fathers were stupid, but Augustine's one of the fathers I read and I'm like, man, I get so much out of him compared to the others. Like I get much more out of reading Chemnitz and Gerhard than I do out of reading a lot of the early fathers, but Augustine is one of the clear exceptions. I get so much out of his stuff all the time.
yeah,
He's so good. Then next I have On the Holy Spirit by Basil. It's a very good work. I highly recommend it. Um, and it is important for a lot of pertinent issues today, specifically on Sola Scriptura, because I believe it's chapter 36 or 38 where he talks about tradition and how important it is. So it's a very often cited passage, and it's very important. And then he makes some really really good arguments. really, really good arguments for the divinity of the Holy Spirit. So, anything on there, Seth?
No, nope. That's
Okay.
all. That's all correct. Wait, what other works do we have by the Cappadocians? Oh, we have Neeson in there. Okay, yeah,
Yeah. I'm not three gods. That's really important because of inseparable operations. Like
yeah.
super
That's the
important.
main point of the work. Is that the
Yeah.
reason the Trinity is not a pantheon is because of inseparable operations.
Yeah.
It's not
Super
actually its
important.
most important work. Like we could have put against Eunomius, but
Mhm.
because against Eunomius probably is his most important work and it's much longer and more thorough. But if you're trying to get like a brief overview, like you don't need to read every single really long work. Like you don't need to read
Right.
all of Against Heresies, all of City of God, all of On the Trinity by Augustine. You don't need to read all of Against Eunomius. Like to get like a brief overview of patristic thought, and then to get more to the theology and more precise stuff, you can honestly read later authors like Chemnitz or
Yeah.
Gerhard.
Yeah.
Um, that work in particular, I think, is really important simply because a lot of debates about social Trinitarianism today, about inseparable operations, and I think if you read that, it gives you insight into what did the early fathers and specifically the people who are in the 300s who are in like the main debate, like how are they framing the Trinity and how are they saying it is not three gods
Yeah.
specifically, because that's like one of the main debates today in theology.
Mhm. Yeah, and then Euler says that doesn't Basil have an against the Eunomia or against Eunomius or against the Eunomians? I haven't read that, so I can't say.
Um, uh, I forget if Basil has a work like that.
I
I'm
see.
not remembering now. The Cappadocians in general
Yeah,
have a lot on Trinity stuff in general. Like they have a lot of
yeah,
things about the Trinity, and Nisa also has,
yeah. He
I
does.
believe, a second work against Eunomia as like a letter or something.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
Basil does. Centurion just commented dire made against Eunomius. Ah,
he
the
does like to
true
cite against
apostolic.
Eunomius,
Yeah,
because a lot of people like to cite it to try and argue actually against classical theism, but really all that actually gets argued is that the things are not strictly logically distinct if you actually read it more carefully. But anyhow,
yeah.
that's besides the point.
And when you talk about logically distinct, do you mean logically distinct without a foundation in the thing, or logically distinct with a
Yes, yeah, yeah.
foundation?
Without a
Yeah, like
foundation in Ray or
but
Rice,
it's
yeah,
so funny to me because no Thomist is going to say that there are no distinctions in God in the sense that none have logical founding, or no founding at all. Like there are going to be distinctions that are based in the world in some sense, or based in reality. Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, for example, he criticizes the nominalists by saying that there is no virtual distinction; there's only purely logical distinctions within the attributes. He says that this is wrong, and that you
yeah.
would
So
have
pretty much the exact thing that is getting countered in that work. It's the
right,
late nominalist position.
yeah.
Anyhow,
So
moving on.
yeah, yeah, and then Ecclesiastical History by Eusebius and Rufinus. I haven't read it. I've read portions of Ecclesiastical History actually by Eusebius. I
I've read
have.
all of it, and it's all worth reading. So there
Good.
are other like church histories. There's Sozomen and Socrates, and they're a
Hmm.
little later, and Theodoret. But
Hmm.
that's like the staple classic one.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Centurion said as well that we are obligated to put Cyril of Alexandria somewhere on here. No, I know. I know. I just haven't read him yet, man. I just haven't. I'm sorry. I got into patristics like relatively recently in my life. I haven't gotten to Cyril yet. And I've
Um,
been spending a lot more time with the modern Lutherans that I have than patristics. So my apologies, but I haven't read him. I've
yeah,
read great
Cyril's
quotes and
pretty
commentaries,
useful. I
but
mean,
not like full on works.
yeah, especially if
Sorry,
you want to
Seth.
understand Chalcedon, Cyril's pretty useful, because like they're arguing a lot of just like pretty much saying, well, we stick with Cyril. It's pretty much
Yeah,
like half the statements at Chalcedon in the
yeah,
Acts.
yeah. No, and I agree. Like Cyril of Alexandria is like the top church father that I haven't read yet. Where I'm like, I have to read him. So I promise you, I would put him on here if I'd read him. Seth, did you put synodal tome for the Council of Chalcedon? Was it you that put it by
Yeah, I
Leo the
put that
First?
on. So that's
Yeah, can you
I mean
explain?
that's like the basic statement from Leo to the Council of Chalcedon. So if you want to get like what was the Western take on like Christology going into Chalcedon, that's the one you want to read. It's really short. It's like a little letter, so it's well worth reading. Spend 5 minutes.
Yeah, yeah. Centurion said that Cyril of Alexandria is pretty good. He said cereal, like he spelled it as cereal, Seth. I think he's making
Material.
fun of the way I pronounce him. How dare you? If you are making fun of me, how dare you? Nah, it's fine. I think it's funny how I pronounce things. I have my girlfriend makes fun of me so much because when I pronounce the word commercial, I pronounce it like as though as an A instead of an E, so commercial. I don't know. She makes fun of me. She gets so mad. She's like, it's commercial. So I have weird pronunciations. So yeah. Uh, I also have yeah, this was one that I think Centurion or somebody recommended that I'm like, "Oh, I had this, but I forgot to write it down." Fall of All Nations by Prosper of Aquitaine. Duh. Like,
That's a really good one,
yeah.
especially for Lutheran soteriology.
Yep. Um, and then I think it was Cameron who recommended Exact Exposition of the Orthodox Faith. I've just straight up have not read it. Like, I just straight haven't read it. That's Cameron who put it there. I can't say anything on it.
I read sections. It's like sometimes called the first scholastic work, because it is like philosophical theology in a systematic manner. Um,
Yeah.
it's pretty much like the capstone of Eastern Christianity as far as like how the West how the West gathers Eastern theology. It's like the spot to go. Like he's the guy that represents the East and kind of summarizes everyone who came before him and systematizes it all.
Nice. That
It's
sounds
probably
good.
the most thorough, like systematic theology in Christianity, probably of anyone prior to Peter Lombard.
Mhm. Yeah. And then Centurion, you're right. Aquinas does quote John Damascene a lot, as does Chemnitz. Chemnitz does a lot in his Two Natures.
Yeah.
He's very well liked, and there's a reason. I mean, I don't know anybody who just explicitly hates him. I mean, maybe the Reformed, maybe the
Uh,
Reformed hate him.
because he's such an iconodual.
Yeah, yeah. Well. I meant in terms of like
Oh, it's
Christology.
Christology.
Obviously, the iconodual stuff is that's one thing, but in terms of his Christology, um,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh yeah. I don't know how to pronounce your name. I don't know if it's Same Riza or like it's supposed to be something foreign like Same Raiza or something like that. But he said that he's reading the Roland commentary on Ecclesiastes, which he somehow found in a Georgia used bookstore. Okay, or a Burl one. So when I made my dispensationalism video, I quoted this work called like Reflections of a Recovering Dispensationalist. That was the best book on the topic that I like straight up ever read. It's like 100 pages maybe, and, like, I found it for literally $1 in a used bookstore in San Diego. The guy who wrote it was a reformed pastor, who's totally off the grid, I can't find him anywhere. It's unavailable on Amazon, you can't find it, but it's so good. So sometimes you just find random things like that, and I was so blessed by it. Yeah. Oh, yeah, and then Centurion reminds me this is true. Vermigli, the reformed theologian, quotes Theodoret instead on
Oh
Christology.
yeah, yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah, the Reformed will sometimes quote Theodoret positively on Christology, which is just like it's that's so backwards.
Yeah, it's really bad. It's, like, really
Read
bad
if you read through the price editions of the ecumenical councils.
because isn't he
Not a
condemned
good
for
thing
his
to do.
Christology at one point or something like that?
What was that?
Was he condemned for his Christology at one point?
Yeah, the three chapters controversy. Well, some of his writings get condemned on
Mhm.
Christology.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you're gonna, I mean, Theodoret, like you can cite him as kind of like Tertullian or Origin, like cite him on things where he's not controversial. That's how he's like more used. Um, but yeah, to cite him on Christology is just like you're literally citing a heretic.
Yeah.
As far as Christology goes, at least it'd be like citing Origin on, it'd be like citing Origin on Christology, or like Origin on the nature of the soul, like
Mhm.
and trying to use it as a positive in your argument when it's literally the heretical position that gets
Mhm.
condemned.
Yeah, so Matt Scarpelli comments, "Can we admire Seth for doing the laundry during the stream?" He's actually ironing, I believe, or are you doing any laundry with it?
Yeah, I'm just ironing. I
Uh, but we can admire
yeah,
you for that. We can be happy, you know? We can be
so
glad.
the
Um,
laundry had to get done.
so Oilers people comments that Kalov says one should study logic, Nostology, Nuology, metaphysics, pneumatics, and physics to prepare to be a theologian. And then Centurion, I agree with you. I've never heard of Nostology, Nuology, or Pneumatics. I have no clue what those things are. So if you can enlighten us, if you can enlighten us, please do.
Wait, what
I,
was that? Pneumatics,
uh,
as in the study of airflow.
I mean, that'd be insanely
I
base.
think he
But
probably meant pneumatology, maybe. Unless
well,
he was making a joke.
I don't know. I mean, pneumatology, obviously, but he said to prepare to be a theologian. So pneumatics, probably not pneumatology because you gotta, you do that as a theologian, not when you prepare.
Oh yeah, I guess
I
pneumatics, yeah,
also
to
don't
study
know what,
airflow.
yeah, I also don't know what Nestology and Nuology are, but please give us some info on it. So yeah, that's all I have for the patristic section. Again, I want to recap this by saying, like, there are so many works to read, like, so many that I just haven't read that I can't say, and some works I've read that I would still recommend that haven't, or that I read a while back. Like, I've pretty much read all of Tertullian's works in the public domain. I have read so much of Ambrose, and like, I'd recommend so much of their works, but I'm not gonna put everything down here. Um, I'm just not. So a lot of the things that you guys think are missing on here, it's like, you know, it's just stuff that I want to be a little more concise. Um, and then J James comments, can you post a link for all these recommendations? Yeah, I'm after this stream, I am going to put a link in the description that has this in I will try to go through every single entry in here and I will try to give a link to it. Most of these, so all the patristic works that I've cited, I think all of them you can find for free on Google, but I'll do links. I'll do links as well. So anything you want to say before I move to philosophy, Seth?
Um, yeah, I guess one more note on the like the limitations of the list. Um, the list, because the list is more of a these book recommendations are not necessarily just like outright general recommendations overall, but rather like if you want to get into theology and get kind of more of a base, these are books we recommend. So like
Yeah.
the reason like a lot of notable works may be absent is because a lot of like the same ideas will be touched on in later authors and more developed or more concise or maybe explained in a more digestible way. And
Yeah.
so these are more like the works that we thought would be useful to people to read like in their own right, just to get more knowledge on theology, not necessarily just to like get a patristic overview, which if
Right.
you were trying to do that, there would be other works in here that we didn't put in.
Yeah. And I would say, like, we're gonna especially see that with philosophy because there are, for example, I think I have like a few books that introduce Aquinas or something like that, or maybe like one or two, but they each touch on different things, kind of. Um, and if I wanted to just give you book recommendations to understand Thomas Aquinas' philosophy, I'd give you like 30 or 40. Like, I'm not gonna do that. So, um, kind of same logic here with patristics. Like, I'm trying to get you involved, and like these are good books to read, but I'm not gonna give you every single recommendation I could possibly. Centurion says there's a section of he asked I want to read through his three comments 'cause he's actually really relevant. So talking about the patristics, he asks where Francis Chan's crazy love is. And I think that's a really solid question. What do you think, Seth? Is there a reason we haven't added that?
He's pretty on the border of patristic thought there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we're counting anybody after 2020 as patristic. He's Crazy Love is what 2015 or something like that. It's really close. So I don't
Yeah.
know.
You know, Seth, you remember that guy that I interviewed a while back, Stephen Kozar?
Oh
Did you
yeah,
ever watch that? So he
yep.
had a really good video recently. Like his best videos by far. Not by far. Like I love all of his stuff so much. He's probably my favorite Christian YouTuber because he's just funny. But one of his best ones recently is so one of the evangelical leaders, like the thought leaders, Mike Bickle has been like, basically accused of, sexual misconduct, all this stuff. And Francis Chan, what he did was he in this video he posts all these clips from Francis Chan where Francis Chan's just like, why would you guys criticize Benny Hinn and Mike Bickle? They just love Jesus, and he's like crying. It just like I don't take him seriously in any way. Like when I was younger, I mean, he wasn't like as bad as he is now, but uh, oh my gosh, he's so bad.
He
It's
used
like
to be like my
embarrassing.
favorite when I was an evangelical.
He used to be what?
He used to be like my favorite when I was an
Uh,
evangelical.
Oh man, I don't know if I didn't really care as much. Like when I was an evangelical, I wasn't really reading too much theology, to be honest with you. Like I started by the end, and at that point, I was reading like more Thomas Aquinas, and I was reading some evangelical stuff. But eventually, I was just like, yeah, I can't really affirm this. So like, I haven't read way too much. Centurion, yeah, we're gonna when we get to philosophy, Coppin's brief textbooks, yeah, those are really good. Those are really good. Coppin's is great. Um, yeah. So I'm gonna get into philosophy now. So I have bolded Socratic Logic by Peter Kraft. That's a really good book to introduce you to logic. Because he goes over really interesting stuff in there. It's the first book on logic I read, and I really think you should read that before you read any other work of philosophy if you're going to get into the more advanced stuff, because you really want a good ground in logic before you're going to be touching on these really advanced metaphysical arguments. Oh, and I should also mention, when I talk about philosophy here, I am mostly going to be doing philosophy, religion, and metaphysics. I don't have anything here in ethics, philosophy of mind, any of that stuff, just because like that's not as important when you're talking about for theology. I'm trying to look into works like how important are they for our theological conclusions. Like maybe philosophy of mind has some stuff, but and ethics kind of does. But like at the end of the day, ethics is really covered in scripture very clearly for the most part. And then philosophy of mind, um, it is important. It's valuable. I obviously recommend read it, but I'm going to be mainly working on metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and then maybe some physics. So yeah. But overall, yeah, I said Socratic Logic, Peter Kraft. That's really good. Just you want to start off with something logical. There are way more books on logic you can read as well. There are so many out there. Of course, there are some of the from the neo scholastics. Obviously, Coppens has some good stuff. Um, Peter Coffey has some really good stuff. Like everybody does out there, and modern universities put out some really solid stuff too. Um, but yeah, I just have that because that's what I read, and yeah, I learned a lot from it. I need to reread it at some point. Have you read that one, Seth?
No, I haven't. I haven't read a
Okay.
lot of the like neoscholastics or manualists or
Mhm.
frankly at most I haven't read a lot of the modern like summaries of scholastic
That's
or
okay.
just philosophy in general. I've read a lot more primary sources.
Mhm. Yeah, J. James, you say that you just jump straight into the Summa. I mean, good luck. You said you're on question 67. Like, are you understanding it well? Because that's really good. Like, his Summa is not incredibly hard or anything like that, but you have to know his terms. That's part of why I put it in the intermediate works, opposed to the beginning works or the introductory works, because like a lot of it's more just do you understand the terminology he's going for? Because if you have no clue what form and matter are, you're kind of like screwed. You're just like, what?
Yeah.
So, um, speaking of which, the second book I have is Scholastic Metaphysics by Phaser. I'm not even necessarily saying like, hey, I agree with every conclusion he has, but I have it in bold because like he is just a really good introduction. Like again, I disagree with him on some stuff, but he's just such a good introduction to things that I actually don't really know of any other works that would introduce scholasticism as well in my mind.
Maybe Voltaire's Summa Metaphysicae.
Yeah, I have it in there. But the reason I have it in there, it's not bold, but the reason I have Phaser is because it's much longer and it touches on more stuff too. But yeah, no, Sumio Metaphysicae, I'll get into in a minute. Yeah, and then I have Introduction to Philosophy of Religion by Brian Davis. He's pretty good. Yeah, he's very good. Sumio Metaphysicae, just as you and I were talking. So that's by Alan Wolter, who's a Scotist. Phaser is a Thomist. He's an analytic Thomist, and uh, Wolter is definitely a Scotist. I've heard from Byzantine Scotists that Wolter every once in a while can be wrong on things, like he misinterprets the formal distinction actually, for like a tiny bit. Um, but he's still really good, and Byzantine Scotus recommends him as most people do. So yeah. Um, Centurion also comments that Dictionary of Scholastic Philosophy and Mueller's Theological Dictionary are essential as well. Yeah, that's true. I should definitely put in the Dictionary of Scholastic Philosophy. I use it a lot. I gotta put that in. It's not something that you just straight read, but it's more a resource to have. Uh, so yeah. Anything you want to say, Seth, about like Scholastic Metaphysics if you've read it?
I haven't read all of Scholastic Metaphysics, but I've read a good chunk of it. The reason I stopped reading it was because um, I like knew the stuff from
Yeah.
like other sources. And so I was like, this is kind of a drag to like read like a pretty dry book on things I already know. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
the one thing I did notice that was pretty good about that I didn't get from other sources was his like attack on scientism. Because
Yes.
he's like, Phaser is a big guy about bringing Aristotle back into science and things like that. So that part was pretty interesting, like attacking Humean type things, empiricism and stuff.
Right. Yeah, and he engages a lot of modern work. Like that's the best part of it, honestly. Um, he does some really good stuff with respect to responding to like a lot of modern analytic. Um,
Yeah.
just all that, and that's where I especially
And it's
recommend
good
him.
illustrations, and he's pretty good
Yeah,
at presenting it at a level that you don't need like a lot of academic credentials to understand.
yeah, right. Yeah, I agree. Um, So I also have Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius or Boethius, however you say his name. I think that's just a Christian classic, but I didn't put it in like patristics because even though it's early work, like it's much more philosophical than it is like purely patristic. Um, so I consider it
Yeah.
a philosophical
I
work.
mean, if you want Boethius theological stuff, read his theological tractates, which are like
Yeah,
60 pages and
yeah,
are quite good, but
mhm,
they're definitely not an essential work in patristics by any means.
yeah, yeah. Um, then Centurion, yeah, I've read Phaser's Five Proofs. It's pretty good. I think there are stronger versions of each of those arguments that can be used. Like it's a good introduction to that stuff. But like I think his presentation of, for example, the deante, so the argument from Essence and Existence, I think that's like one of the weaker presentations of it. I'd recommend another book that I have written down as well in some of the later stuff in the intermediate works category that much better. I think just a lot of authors cover it so much better than Phaser does. Same with the
Yeah,
first way, the Aristotelian proof. Same with Plotinus's. The best thing he does is honestly the Augustinian work. And if you want to get in contingency, like I would just straight recommend Prus on that. Like Prus, Rasmussen, and then I think Pat Flynn's doing stuff with it. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend Phaser as the best guy for the proofs, but like I would not recommend it. Like I really enjoyed reading it and it does help you get an introduction, but there are much stronger versions of each of the arguments in my mind elsewhere that you can find. What do you think, Seth?
um, yeah, it's a good introduction at least. I will
Yeah.
say it's Phaser, so he's good at presenting things at a popular level. So if
Yeah.
you're just going to read, if you're not going to go to more advanced works, it probably is one of the best works at a very low popular level, like
Yeah,
more
I agree.
beginner popular level.
Yeah, I agree. Uh, other than that, I have, of course, from Anselm, I have Monologion, De Concordia, and Proslogion. Um, is it Monologion or Monologion? I don't know, but regardless,
I don't know. Well, I guess it
my
depends on how you do your Latin too.
yeah,
Ecclesiastical or classic.
my hot take is I like the Monologion much better than the Proslogion. I just think it's more interesting personally. The Proslogion is, for reference, where uh he has he has the ontological arguments. The monologion is more where he talks about divine attributes, and that's where I'm more interested personally with respect to Anselm. And then Centurion, who do I think covers the Aristotelian argument best? It's a really good question. I think that
Aristotle.
the sorry,
Did Aristotle?
base. Well, I think the person who covers it, honestly, I would just straight read the Aquinas' chapter in the Summa Contra Gentiles on it. I just straight up do that. I mean, Facer does a good job, but I think there are also some papers that are really good on it. I mean, I just have to be honest, like the argument from motion is one of the weaker ones to me. Like, I just don't find it as compelling, especially because like there are a lot of these objections from physics, in the modern sense of the word physics, where I'm not saying they work against it. I'm not saying I don't think it's correct, but ultimately I'm just not a fan of the argument. So I'd say there are some papers from some pretty good people on it. I think Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange covers it pretty well, as too. Same with Etienne Gilson. Like a lot of introductory works to Aquinas cover it very well. But Phaser's like fine. I think the issue is that Phaser, uh, when he looks at it in terms of change, I think it's more interesting to look at it in terms of a kind of like existential change as opposed to purely just like motion. Uh, I think it's more interesting to look at it from existential change. I think that's where you're going to get it the strongest. So yeah. Okay. And then finally, I have the Euthyphro and the Republic by Plato. I know that's kind of an odd selection. Seth, you know way more about Plato than I do. Are there
Um,
any others that you'd say that somebody has to read?
hmm. So a lot of people like the Timaeus. Um, I wasn't personally a huge fan of the Timaeus, but
I wasn't either.
not because it doesn't have good stuff in it. It just has a lot of like Platonic physics mixed in, which is not that useful or interesting. I mean, maybe it's interesting if you like weird theories on triangles, but like the Timaeus is like a standard one in terms of like Plato's cosmology and his theory on like how God works, kind of like, or more specifically, the demiurge, like the creator. Um, so the Timaeus, the Republic's really a staple work. Um, I mean, if you Google like Plato and like look at like the topics he discusses in the works, you can pick that up. I actually do have a list. I should have pulled this up earlier. Here, let me pull it up real quick.
Yeah. I'm also going to add in his apology. His apology is super important.
Let's see. Yeah. Okay, so yes, the apology. So I think what I would recommend is that you pretty much read the famous works, or what you can do is um, get his definitions, which is an apocryphal work, but like it's written like not long after, or if it is written by Plato, then it is sure. Um, but like keep that as like a book on hand because like it's useful for like the terms he define or defining the terms he's using. So get that book on hand. Um, and then like if you look at the tetralogies, which is like how his they're organized. If you Google like Plato tetralogies, you'll find these. Um, you'll see them like gathered up into things. And I think reading the whole first tetralogy is pretty like if you want to get like an idea of like what's like the base of Plato, like that's like the starting point, which is the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Credo, and the Phaedo.
Oh yeah, I
Um,
forgot the Credo and Fredo. Those are really good.
yeah, so that's kind of like the life and death of a philosopher is how I describe the theme.
I can't
Um,
remember. How do you spell Credo again? Is it? It's,
Credo is Crito.
that's right, Creto. Yeah, that's right. Credo. Yeah.
Um, and then there's you can kind of like pick and choose out of the other like tetralogies based on like the topics. Tetralogy 3 is kind of on transcendentals and wisdom, which is like kind of an interesting mix. Um, but so that's Parmenides, Philebus, Symposium, and Phaedrus. Um, so you could look at those. And then the uh, last couple. So then the last end section is like political mythology and political law. I'd say skip the political law pretty much, honestly, unless you're really into philosophy of law. But Tetralogy 8, political mythology, um, is how I categorize Tetralogy 8. That's Clitopho, Republic, Timaeus, and the Critias, which are all honestly like they're pretty related. If you read them all in a row like that, you see how they're related to one another,
Hmm.
and they all kind of do like build on each other. And specifically, Republic, Timaeus, and Critias are like kind of a trilogy type thing, and Clitopho is kind of tacked on at the beginning, if I'm remembering this correctly.
And then always people ask, what are your thoughts on the Parmenides?
Um, Specifically on the Parmenides. It's it's interesting work. So Parmenides is like one of those harder ones to understand. That's where you're getting to like the monad and stuff like that.
Hmm.
In terms of like philosophical value, it's very influential because like you're getting stuff on well monadology,
I'm gonna
but like
include it. Yeah.
on being and the one. So you're getting like kind of stuff that's harder to understand and interpret. But in terms of like value, it's very valuable because it's discussing, these transcendentals of unity and being. Um, so it's definitely one of the more difficult ones. In not that any of Plato is exceptionally hard. If you sit down and like think through the argument being made, you can understand it. Um, but no, it's a good work.
Yeah.
All of his
Um,
more famous works are pretty good. It's his less famous works that are they're less famous for a reason. They're not like
yes.
bad, but like a lot of it's just like very like
Hmm.
common sense. A lot of like the ones that are more like practical like stuff is just like okay, I don't need to be told for the fifth time that a lawyer is better at law than a mathematician.
Yeah. Oilers people also tells us to read Plotinus. I agree. I've read the Enneads or Aeneads. It's pretty good. Some parts of it are boring, but a lot of it's pretty good. In terms of like his discussion of simplicity, unity, and oneness stuff's pretty good. I don't remember way too much to be honest, but I really enjoyed it when I was reading it. Um, and then Centurion says he'd rather just read the medieval scholastics and manualists than a lot of the ancient Greeks themselves. I mean, honestly, I agree. Like, there's a reason, somebody is going to comment on here, and why don't you have any Aristotle on here? Because like Aristotle is so much better when he's just summarized by people. Like he puts some things in such confusing ways that if you just read a commentator, I'm like, oh, that makes so much more sense. And like, I mean, just be honest, the scholastics and neo-manualists, or the manualists, neo-scholastics and the old scholastics do a really good job of summarizing him. And even if they like aren't fully true Aristotelians, where they're not taking everything and just say I'm an Aristotelian in like a true peripateic sense, they take the best parts of him. So like I don't blame you. I haven't like I read a lot of Aristotle and I was bored so much of the time, so I don't blame you at all. Um so those are the beginner works. Moving into the intermediate works, I have Treatise on the One God by Aquinas. That's part of the Summa Theologiae. Um yeah, it's like I have it bolded. That's like necessary. I think every single Christian should have to read that because it's so influential. And it's really, really good. I think because what's so good about it in my mind is that he doesn't only just make an argument for some entity that's like, it's kind of powerful. It's kind of powerful, it can do things, and like it's necessary. That's it. It's like, nah, he goes through practically every divine attribute in that section. It's so good in that respect. And even if you disagree with him, nonetheless, like it's so influential on Christian tradition in the West that it's pretty necessary. So, yeah. Was there anything you wanted to add, though, Seth, for the introductory philosophical works?
Um, so if you want more like introductory, if you want introductory Aquinas or Bonaventure from Aquinas or Bonaventure, you can read Aquinas's Compendium.
Yes, let me add that.
Yeah, which is he didn't finish it, just like he didn't finish the Summa.
Yep.
But that's a
Bonaventure's
great one. And then
and Breviloquium.
yeah, Bonaventure's Breviloquium,
Yep. Yep.
which I really like. I reference that actually when I'm like, oh, I want to know about this topic. Like, just like I'd reference like, oh, I'll go look it up in Chemnitz or something. I typically also look up Bonaventure to see what he said.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah, those are good works too. I've read parts of the Breviloquium. I haven't read anything on the Compendium. Um, yeah. So back to the intermediate works. I have Treatise on the One God from Aquinas. I have that in bold. I also say maybe read Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange's commentary on it too. It's pretty good work. I recommend that as well. It just significantly expands it. Yeah, it's really good in that respect. Since we're gonna have either of us read Gerhard's Loci on the nature of God. So I think it's on the nature of God and the Trinity, something like that. I haven't read it yet. It's
Like
on my
straight
list.
through,
Yeah.
not straight through, but I've read quite a few sections.
And he asks, how does it compare to the more famous works on God?
Um, I mean, it reads like a Protestant scholastic theology.
Yeah.
I
Well,
don't know more to say than that. So
so
he
what I
goes
will
through like he goes through divine attributes. He goes through some arguments for God. He goes through like words used for God in Scripture,
mhm.
qualities attributed to God. Kind of things you'd expect out of a systematic theology, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know what else
I
to say.
intend to read him soon on that. I'm definitely going to be using him. So like, I made a video a few months ago where I was introducing scholasticism. Like that's not going away. I'm just working on something that takes a lot more time right now. And I'm gonna be spending time reading some of that and seeing, okay, like how does he interact with divine simplicity and stuff like that. So I'm gonna get back to that. Don't you worry. There will be content coming out on this channel about it. And that at the very least involves it. So yeah. I also have Aquinas's On Being and Essence. I mean, yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's one of my favorite. Um, it's one of my favorite works. It's one of the best works of philosophy I've ever read. No question about it. I have it in bold. Yeah, Seth, does he think there's any value in reading that Gerhard work instead of some of the classic works? I mean, I imagine maybe some of the more exegetical stuff.
Is
I
there
don't know if
value
it's
in
as
reading
philosophical.
Gerhard?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, compared
I
to
mean,
like the Summa, like for
oh,
philosophical
oh.
stuff, I guess.
I mean, like they do touch on different things, and Gerhard's working with a more developed, Baroque era scholasticism.
Yeah.
So sometimes he has developed or is working with like more like newer ideas and countering newer ideas that and things that just didn't exist at Aquinas' time, just things that have been new controversies.
Yeah, like
He also does like
Socinians and such.
he does more exegetical work than like say Aquinas does.
Yeah,
Um, and yeah, I mean in terms of like getting like a really thorough theology of God, Gerhard's great. Um,
yeah,
I mean, Gerhard's also doing, he's working original languages, which is really different from Aquinas. He's working in Greek and
yes,
Hebrew and Aramaic. So
yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I also have so I've God, His Existence and His Nature by Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. Um, yeah, it's 2 volumes. It's very good. He covers a lot. I recommend that. Not way too much to say. It's good. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if you've read it, Seth, but I really enjoyed it and I'd recommend it. I had a friend at church who's like, if I were to get in, because he knows his basics of philosophy, he goes, he basically says, like, he asked me, what should I read to understand, say, Thomism? And I'm like, that's a great book to read on it.
Real
Um,
essentialism.
well, yeah, that too, but his existence and his nature.
Oh, God's Existence Tests. I have not read that one.
Yeah,
You've
it's a really
recommended
good
it to
one.
me, and I never have.
Centurion, when you say on the principles of nature, is that Aquinas? Who was it? I can't remember who wrote
uh,
that.
on the principles of nature.
Yeah, Centurion commented that.
Oh, I don't
I
know.
can't remember. I
All I
can't
can think of
remember.
is Prisphion by John Scotus Erigena.
Oh, it's Aquinas, I believe. Yeah. Um, yeah, I haven't read it honestly yet. I've read a fair amount. It looks really short too. Um, yeah, it looks very yeah, this is really short. So I'll put that in. I mean, I won't put it in since I haven't read it, but it sounds pretty good. So I should read it. Um, Yeah, and the next I have in bold, Real Essentialism by David Oderberg. It's a good work because I think it really does cover a lot of the scientific issues. And he talks a lot. Like I think he does a really good job talking about form and matter and the necessity of it. And he also engaged with some modern analytic work. Like I honestly considered it to be a slightly more advanced version of phase or scholastic metaphysics. That's kind of how I look at it. And so I recommend it. I have it in bold because it's really good. I've read through it twice. I really enjoyed it. He does some great stuff. Yeah, Centurion, I'll have to add that to my list then. I'll literally put that in my reading list to read the on the principles of nature because I haven't read it yet. So yeah. Seth, have you read Real Essentialism at all?
No, I've like looked at it before, but
Yeah,
I haven't
it's
like
good.
read it in any substantial manner at all.
Yeah, I actually used it in a college paper once. I mean that was that one that paper I was writing on Plato and universals, and I used an argument from
Oh
Oderberg.
well, yeah, that is where a good source to look at.
Yeah, I used it and I got the highest grade in the class. Like we had the whole okay, you have your first draft and then you have to edit stuff and then your final grade is kind of like in between, you know? And I got like a 99 on my first draft and the only edits were just like put a space here, like some formatting stuff. It was not content. He's like, this was amazing. Like, just keep it the way it is. Cause I basically just took a lot of Oderberg and some of his arguments. Of course, I cited him, but like some of his best stuff was there. So I used it. I had my own stuff, of course, too, but Oderberg was great. Um, Next, I have History of Philosophy by Friedrich Copleston. I mean, yeah, it's a great history of philosophy. Uh, he, yeah, there are a lot of volumes. I want to say there are at least like six. But it's pretty good. I've only read a bit of it actually, but I have the whole thing on here because what I did read was really, really solid. And so I'd say recommend, pretty much all of it. Have you read it? Have you read any of that stuff?
Nope, I haven't. My
Okay,
history of philosophy knowledge is from podcasts and lectures.
no, that's right. Arthur F. Holmes is amazing, isn't he?
Yeah, Holmes
Um,
and Hopwag.
yep. I also have Ontology by Peter Coffey. That's a good one. That's a good one. I recommend that too. It's really good. Like I need to reread the section on real relations. I've been meaning to do that for a little while now. I got a lot out of but I honestly can't remember too much because it was at a kind of chaotic point in time of my life. I was reading at this really chaotic time. And so so much of my mental energy from them was focused on other stuff. I just straight don't remember a lot of it. And I wish I did. Just got to reread parts of it. Um, yeah. The next one I have here is there's this one called The Reducibility of Essence to Existence. I think the full title is The Reducibility of Essence to Existence in Existential Metaphysics. It's like it's the second best work I've encountered that touches the relationship between essence and existence in like Thomism. It's amazing. And what's really good about it is he touches on the incorrect views of Giles of Rome and Henry of Ghent. Um, he does a really good job of that. So William Carlo. It's so good. I highly recommend. I read it last year. Oh my gosh, amazing. So yeah, and then we have another work by Alan Wolter, Transcendentals and Their Function in the Metaphysics of John Duns Scotus. I think that's what it's called. It's just Wolter. He's great on Scotus, and Byzantine Scotus recommended this one as well. I recommend it because it covers well on the Transcendentals, just how are they related, um, and in the Scotus system, and how do they interact with Scotus's philosophy? Because I do think there are really valuable aspects of Scotus's philosophy, even if you're not a Scotus. Like I really enjoy his use of the disjunctive transcendentals. Like even if you're a straight up Thomist or you're some other scholastic, I think the use of the disjunctive transcendentals is great. Um, yeah, Seth, have you read that one yet? I know you've read some stuff from Walter.
I've mostly read the Summa Metaphysicae
Okay.
by Walter.
Uh,
I've like read some of his like little bits from papers, and that's like it.
yeah, he's
Other than
great.
that,
The next one I have is Aquinas' Way to God. This is another one that's basically on essence and existence, but this one is more directed towards his argument for God's existence on the basis of that. So William Carlos is not as much about the argument for God; it's more just purely essence and existence. Whereas uh, Kerr goes into how it relates to God's existence, and it's very good. It's much better in my mind than what Phaser did in his Five Proofs, because what Phaser in my mind kind of does, he only stops at like, or the main focus of Phasers, from what I recall, was kind of like that there's at the very least more than a conceptual distinction. When we talk about some entity, we talk about like, oh, the knowledge of a tree's existence does not enter into its essence, or sorry, a tree's existence, a status of existence does not enter into its essence. So like you can know the essence of a thing without knowing its existence. That's like part of Aquinas' argument. But Kerr does really, really good work talking about like the more important stuff, which has to do with participation and the theoretical possibility of more than one entity that has an essence identical to existence. So Kerr is really good in that. He touches on modern objections too. Um, yeah, I really liked it. It's super expensive though. I'm sorry, it's just expensive. Um, yeah. Have you read that one, Seth?
nope.
Okay. The next few I'll go through quickly. I bold Summa Contra Gentiles, or Against the Heathen, by Thomas Aquinas. That's his other Summa. That one's easier to read, I think, in terms of that one's easier than the Summa Theologia, at least in terms of like just the amount of time it takes to read. Um, there are some like presuppositionalists out there who criticize like no one's been convinced, no atheist or Muslim has been convinced of Christianity on the basis of this book, and it's like, I mean, okay, but for one, this was from from like the 13th century, and so the debates back then were different than they are now. And plus, like, I mean, I just have to be honest with you. Um, a lot of the book's value is not necessarily just, hey, responses to like atheism. So much of it is more so going into these like more advanced philosophical debates of, can God know singulars if God's knowledge, if matter is potency, and we talk about, God's knowledge being identical to himself and all that kind of stuff. So it's more advanced philosophical stuff than it is like, hey, here's a convert some dude on the street, right? What is no name comments? That is there anything on Moa Sadra? I have no clue what that is, to be honest with you.
Mul Asadra.
Yeah, let me Google this. I mean, I trust you, no name. Like this sounds cool, but
Do we have anything on it? We don't have anything on
it's
our list.
this guy's a Persian Islamic mystic and philosopher. I just
Yeah.
straight up never heard of him. I just
Uh,
have not. So like, I'm sorry, I haven't.
we don't have
And
anything
for
on
the
the list.
record,
No.
like,
We didn't have anything
for-
on the list really, actually, in general. And I think about it, that really, I mean, like some of these sources touch on Avicenna and Averroes,
yeah. So
but we
he
don't have anything on
apparently
here.
he did a lot of work. Um, Apparently, he says that he did a lot of work with synthesizing Avicenna's work with some other stuff. So, yeah, I mean that sounds interesting. He sounds interesting. Um, yeah, and I mean it seems to be in some sense a reconciliation of Thomism in this, insofar as he says existence is prior to essence.
Interesting.
And that's not in the existentialist sense, the modern, where it's like you kind of define things yourself, like your essence, you get to define who you are. It quite literally is more so like analogy of being and all this stuff like that. No, this guy seems really interesting. I just straight never heard of him, so I'm sorry. Like,
Yeah, I'm not familiar.
um, yeah,
I know earlier Muslim stuff a little bit, but that's it.
yeah, I know Avicenna relatively well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, man. I've not heard of him. I haven't heard of him, man. I know it says that he has a really good ontological argument, so I'd be curious to read that. That's a good recommendation. Thanks for bringing that out. I'm gonna put that in my reading list, actually. Um, yeah, that's great. And then the next two I have are just Duns Scotus by Richard Cross and Avicenna by John McGinnis. Just good introductions to these thinkers. Like nothing crazy to say. They're just both good introductions to these guys. And then yes, no name. Avicenna's contingency is like my favorite argument for God's existence. That and Aquinas' argument from the De Ante et Essentia, alongside Scotus' triple primacy. Avicenna's contingency is like amazing.
Yeah, the
Uh,
contingency Avicenna's contingency argument is uh it's just really solid, like, and it's understandable.
And
Uh,
there's, like, no serious ontological commitments that it makes. Like, it doesn't make a huge argument out of, like, principle sufficient reason or something like that. So,
yeah. Whereas Scotus
yeah,
like total primacy is awesome, but like it's way longer and harder to understand for the average
yeah.
person.
Yeah, and Aquinas requires a lot of I mean, not a lot, but
Oh,
a good amount of
De Ente is
ontological
way
commitment.
hard to understand too,
Yeah,
compared to
it's way
like
harder to understand, but I think, like, as a Christian, like, as somebody who is already convinced of God's existence, it's the argument that, like, is most interesting theologically to me, in how it develops, like, our radical dependence on God as we are, our essence and our existence are distinct in such a way that it's not in God. Like, I think it does a lot interestingly in theology. But I love it philosophically too, but it's much more advanced. So yeah, I'll have to look into it, Melisandre. You say that it doesn't require a PSR. That's interesting. I'd be curious to see because contingency arguments that require PSR, they can totally work, and depends on your version of the PSR. Like Matt Flynn's putting out one. Rob Coons and Alex Proust have done working out. Like Proust and Rasmussen made these like super restricted versions of the PSR in one of those more modern books, and yeah, PSR is getting a lot of work today.
Richard of St.
And I'm going to
Victor's
get back to
solution
that
to
in a minute.
PSR is the most
Sorry,
interesting. Oh,
what?
so Richard of St. Victor's solution for PSR is the most interesting one.
Oh, really?
He just
Interesting.
says that everyone believes it
I mean, yeah, that's
and then
kind of
moves
an
on.
argument that Proust and
It's
Coons
just
make.
one sentence,
Case,
and it says
case. Yeah.
everyone will admit.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Proust and Kuhns kind of make a similar argument where they basically say that, everybody acts as though it's true. They don't just say it and say, eh. Like they just say, um, he basically just says, like, that if you were, or they say it, Proust makes this argument. I'm gonna get back to this actually. I should get back to this because this is in another book I recommend on this list. I'll get back to it. Next, I have the Trinitarian Theology of St. Thomas Aquinas by Giles Emery. It's a really good work on Trinitarianism. I highly recommend that. Um, Yeah, no name. This is fascinating stuff. I have never I besides Avicenna, I haven't really read any of the Muslim philosophers. I've read some Averroes and I think I read some Al Ghazali, but I haven't really read any of uh whatever his name was you said.
Like
I gotta
Al-Kindi
write these guys down.
or
Mulasandra or
Sadra,
something like that. I gotta write these
or the
names. Like I
Muhadin.
promise you guys, like this
You
sounds
gotta read the
interesting.
Muhadin.
Sorry?
You gotta read the Muhadin.
Oh, shut up, Seth. I've read Dune.
No, not Dune, the Muhadin.
Nah. Who am I mixing that up with? Wait, the Muhaddin. No,
No, that is that I like Dune knocks off of a lot of Arab names.
it's not the Muhaddin that he says. No, I know what you're talking about, the Muhaddin. Uh, what is it? What is the name? It's the Al Qaid or something like that. Um, I can't remember, but nah. Paul Atreides, he is the Muhaddin. He's the
Yeah,
Messiah.
yeah.
He's the Messiah. Fun fact. Um, okay, so I'm gonna get into the advanced works of philosophy. We only have a few more categories here, Seth, and I think the later ones they're gonna be faster than these ones. The philosophical works are the hardest ones to kind of explain as compared to
Yeah.
the theological ones. So yeah, I'm gonna take a break. That's good. I'm just gonna get a drink of water. Can you entertain the people while I'm gone?
Oh yeah. Yep. Yep.
I'll be right back.
We kind of skipped actually at the beginning. I should probably pull up the chat too. See how the comments are going. We skipped at the beginning. We didn't even recommend reading any pre-Socratics at all, which is interesting. I actually read through all the pre-Socratics. They're not long at all, so you can read through all of them pretty quickly. I read through all of them before reading any of almost any other philosophy practically, and that's not. I wouldn't call it essential to read by any means, but if you want to get like a more full history and like see where Plato and like Xenophon are actually coming from, or like Aristophanes even, reading the pre-Socratics is pretty useful, and the pre-Socratic sophists. So like in the typical pre-Socratic collection, which is the Deals collection, or if you want, that's the German, but in English, the translation there's an Ancilla to the pre-Socratic philosophers by I forget who did that volume, but you can get that volume, and that covers everything from Orpheus all the way up to Socrates, except for some of the larger sections of Gorgias, not the Gorgias, but Gorgias the author, and you can get those in I believe it's called the Earlier Sophists or something like that, and you can Google it and you'll find a volume that has a collection of all the early sophists in English translation. It's not a bad read necessarily. And also that Delphic maxims, actually, they're the list of Delphic maxims that know thyself is the famous one. But those are kind of interesting to read too, and you can read them in like 10 minutes. But like to get another background on like what's in the Greek philosophers' minds when they're thinking about like uh, you know basic things leading up to Socrates.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm just writing right now on I'm just writing some like I told people, hey, I'm gonna put this in my reading list. Like I'm doing that right now. Like I'm actually just writing these on my reading list because uh I've condensed my reading list so much so I can spend more time writing and now I have time, a little bit of time to read more philosophy. So I'm trying to have its own little reading list. But I'm trying to spend much more time like writing than I am reading. But yeah, and it's going well. Like I feel so bad. I haven't had like one of those full length scriptums in a while, but like I'm writing one and right now it is like legit fire. It's really good. So like forgive the fact that a lot of my content has been kind of improviso recently, but like I'm putting in the work to give you guys some quality stuff. I got a good one coming. Just trust me on that. Seth, you saw the quote that I sent you yesterday for the one scriptum in the group chat, Chemnitz
Uh,
one.
I'm sure. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
That one is so I read that. I'm like, forgive my language. I just read that. I'm like, holy shit. Like, it's great. Sorry, forgive my language, but it was that level of like, oh my gosh, that's good for this. So, yeah. Anyway, I have a little bit of time, so I'm going to write that in my philosophical reading list. Yeah. So, yeah, for advanced works, we talked a bit about the principle of sufficient reason before. I have the principle of sufficient reason, a reassessment by Alexander Proust. Proust is probably my favorite living philosopher, just straight up. I love him. Uh, Work is phenomenal. It like reinvigorated so much discussion of the PSR. A lot of the objections to the PSR that I've heard, Proust just handles them brilliantly. Like the big conjunct contingent fact or whatever it's called, one the BCCF objection, like Proust just roasts it so good. Highly recommend Proust on that. Again, it's going to be probably expensive though, and maybe it's available. Like a lot of the stuff I can get because my library system is amazing, and some of this stuff has been on like archive.org before.
Yeah, libraries have
Yeah,
a lot of stuff,
yeah. Some
especially
of these, like a lot of these, I
interlibrary
just have in my
alone.
library.
Yeah, libraries.
Yeah. Next I have, and then yeah, no name says, um, wasn't Alexander Proust's PSR refuted? I mean, I'd have to see that. Like, which version? Because he has a million versions. He has so many. Um, he has so many versions, and even if like his version of it, so to speak, is refuted, then what you want to see is, how does he develop arguments nonetheless for PSR? Like, because a lot of what Proust spends his time on in modern works is saying, okay, this version pack here has not been as strong as it, or strong in the sense of like, uh how good it is, how effective it is. So let's make a more restricted one. I think there's been some back and forth on that version of the PSR that he's had in that book, but nonetheless, it's like significant with respect to his establishment of the PSR and modern versions of it. Like if you read Proust's modern stuff, like his more recent ones, like he had the book Necessary Existence with Joshua Rasmussen. I mean, he makes an insanely weak PSR, weak in a good sense of like so little ontological commitment. So it's one of those works that like he's continuing developing over time in terms of like the book was a stepping stone for his more modern stuff, but it's still nonetheless so valuable because even if you say, oh yeah, this version of the PSR is not as good, nonetheless his arguments for it and his responses to historical arguments against it are phenomenal and give you a really good introduction to it. Like just as I would say that, some of the arguments for God's existence that may be based on some kinds of physics, I wouldn't necessarily say are like the strongest. Nonetheless, they give backgrounds to see, well, how do you engage with this? So yeah. No name you say Dr. Khalil Andani says that the contrasted PSR is the most proper PSR to affirm as a theist. Yeah, that's what I've seen. Forms of contrasted PSR. I'm curious to see how Pat Flynn, the author, philosophy for the people. So philosophy for the people, that guy, he has a new book called it's something like the best argument for God or something like that. He has a version of PSR in there. I'd be curious to see how he does it because, I mean, he clearly knows the stuff about PSR. I mean, I wouldn't pretend to be you know, I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on it either, but like I know a decent amount. I'm not as big a fan of the PSR in terms of making arguments because of just like some of the commitments it makes. But I do think it's nonetheless one of the most important things in the history of philosophy. And to be honest with you, like I think it's relatively intuitive to think about in general that the reality is intelligible because there are a variety of versions of the PSR. When you talk to scholastics who engage with the PSR, the scholastics tend to speak of it not in terms of like every event or everything has some kind of explanation, whether that be outside itself or internally. They might speak of it more in terms of like all of reality is intelligible. And I think that's a more interesting form of it. But nonetheless, the analytic form that follows like Leibnizian thought is really interesting that you get in like Proust and others. So yeah, good comments, no name. I like that. Seth, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm sorry that if I'm just like running by this stuff and you don't have anything to
Um,
say, but
I don't have ton to say. Richard of St. Victor treats PSR as everything has an explanation, but it's literally like one sentence, so I don't think it really
yeah,
counts.
yeah.
Um, yeah, the Leibnizian stuff is pretty interesting. I mean, Leibniz in general on logic, kind of expanding like the basic logical rules is
Hmm.
somewhat interesting in general, just as in terms of like developments in the history of logic.
Hmm.
Um, because he also has the identity of indiscernibles.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
so just in general, like you just kind of cool for like how like what are your very base like most basic first principles. Just interesting.
Hmm. Yeah. Zofnir comes. He says, late to the party. Did y'all mention Crafe's Socratic logic? Yep. I got that right here. I got it right here. I have it bold, which means it's that important because it's a good work and it really helps. Um, yeah, no, name, you're right. If you do prove God's existence, you instantly prove PSR after. And I think Proust does make that argument. Well, because what happens is, well, it depends on, I guess you could say it kind of depends on, well, no,
I
it really
mean,
doesn't. I mean,
depends what you mean by
depends.
depends what you mean by God.
Well, yeah, but what I'm
If you
saying
mean just
is like,
any
that's what
form
I
of
was thinking
theism,
about.
maybe not. But
Say it again.
if you just mean any form of theism in general, then maybe not. Like if you prove open theism, or if you not prove open theism, but if you prove that just some form of theism is true, that might not require PSR. But
Yeah. Well, it's not even that. Like, if you have, well, yeah, yeah, open theism, that is true.
yeah, open
But I was
theism
gonna
or like
say,
a
like, if you,
materialist pantheism.
yeah, yeah, what I'm thinking is like, if you have a god of classical theism, like even Aristotle's God, you can kind of have a PSR insofar as you may not say things are rooted in God's like free will, like freedom of the will, like his volition, as much as you could say they're basically necessarily from God. So there's me a variety of like kinds of PSRs and like basically are some based on the gods freedom of the will, or is it like kind of a necessitarian form of it? So I don't know. Um, yeah, and then yeah, Javier or Perdomo. I watch your videos. I just pronounced your name right. He says,
Hey,
"Do
we have a video
if
on his channel coming out.
say it again."
Noah and Mai's interview on his channel is coming
Oh,
out
that's
in
right.
like uh,
Yeah,
2 days, 1 day. I forget now. Watch
yeah.
that.
Well, I look forward to watching it. He asks if we like Matthew Barrett's books on the Trinity and the attributes of God. I've been meaning to read him. I've been meaning to. I haven't read him yet, which is I haven't been here, but I want to read his stuff. No question.
I haven't read it
Uh,
either.
Euler's pupil says that if we can read Latin, which I can't, Allof proves the existence of God as an absolutely simple principium from the law of non-contradiction. Yeah, I'd be curious to see that because, well, a lot of people will argue that God's existence is necessary on the basis of the law of non-contradiction in a variety of ways. So I'd be curious to see how he does it. And then No Name asks more questions about what do you guys think of the Kuzari argument? I think it's the strongest inductive argument for the Torah. I have no clue what that is. Do like you're bringing out these things to me that like I have no clue what you're talking about, and that's a good thing. Like you're showing me how much I don't know, and you're making me really interested in stuff. So thanks for bringing this up. Like keep asking these because I am not sure.
Yeah, I
I'm
didn't
not
know
going to
that
comment
either.
on stuff I don't know. Um, yeah, and yeah, I'm really oh yeah, you did make a reference, Javier. Yeah, you said, "Is this a list of books to listen to while lifting weights?" And yeah, but I learned philosophy while lifting weights
Yeah,
back
here's
in my freshman year, and then you
the
and I
weights
did
back
that,
here.
or my junior year.
I guess you can't see them now. I guess you can kind of see
Yeah,
them. They're the
yeah,
weights.
yeah. That's right.
Putting
Yeah,
clothes
you
on.
still have your sword. Still have your
Oh, the
sword.
sword's upstairs. Yeah,
Okay, like base. And thanks, No Name. Yeah, it's great that you learn from here. That's kind of the point of the channels. We want you guys to learn from us and like us to learn from you because that's one of like legitimately the best things about our channel is I don't feel like we have we're advanced enough where I think our audience is legitimately like really intelligent. And so there are people that comment that I'm like, geez, I'd never thought of this. Like there's that one like Anglican guy. who's I think his profile picture is like Leibniz or something, and he is so intelligent. I'm just like, oh my gosh, this guy knows an insane amount, and so I get a lot from you guys. So thanks for that. Anyway, the next book I have, Actuality, Possibility, and Worlds by Alex Bruce. Again, it's just really good. It's about modal ontology. Very very solid stuff. I really like him. He actually critiques David Oderberg just in a footnote against Oderberg on the use of modal language in essentialism. So I thought it was really interesting. Yeah. So next I have Commentary on Metaphysics by Aquinas. The Commentary on Metaphysics is the commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics. So yeah, I think that's fairly straightforward. Um, Scotus's Ordinatio. Seth, have you read much of the Ordinatio?
Just little sections. I kind of use that and the Summa as like reference tools more than just reading straight through them.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. It's great. It's really good. Um, Speaking of which, I have Treatise on the Triune God by Aquinas in bold because again, it's a really important Trinitarian work. It's also fascinating. And Reginald Garrett-Gougrand has a commentary on it as well that I recommend. So I have it in advanced philosophy because it's more philosophical than it is theological. So much of it is defining it in like your scholastic categories and such, as opposed to saying, well, here's argument that it's in scripture. It's much more philosophical, which is fine, but it's just still more philosophical. So, yeah. Um, and then I have Epistemology by Peter Coffey. It's 2 volumes. It's really good. It's really good. Coffey is my favorite manualist. He's amazing. That's on archive.org. In bold, I have What is Physics by Nigel Kundi. His work is phenomenal. That book came out like maybe a few years ago. I want to say 2019. It's phenomenal. Oh my gosh. It's so good. Um, it's just so good. Um, because it just touches on, like, everything. It's practically a systematic philosophy of science. It's amazing, I love him. And it's so dense, it's great, and price and you can email him and he'll respond. No name, you ask, "So can I give a quick one-paragraph summary of why I hold Scotus's proof so highly?" Same with Avicenne, he never found it convincing. Yeah, so, the reason I really like SCOTUS on it is that what I find especially interesting is effectively the fact that you can go multiple different routes to reach God in a sense, like and especially the establishment of the different divine attributes, and, so my appreciation of the argument has more to do with the fact that how he engages the divine attributes and how he proves the unicity of God. I think he does a really interesting job when he talks about how, like, if you have different gods with different wills, then you run into this weird issue of who is willing what. And same with the intellect. I think that's really interesting. And as for the actual proof, I really like that the triple primacy route of basically saying, any of these is if any of these works, and you basically establish all these other attributes that the other arguments work regardless. So I find that really interesting. So I find the form of the argument really interesting, or the structure of it. That's what I really love about it. I wouldn't necessarily put it on Avicenna's. I did say earlier that it's one of my favorites, but in terms of like the actual like argument itself, it's not as strong as the Avicennian in my mind, but I still think it's just so fascinating and it's really well done that like in an ideal world, if I had time and I was a professional philosopher, I would probably make a book was taking the Scotian argument and like improving the actual quality of the argument itself while keeping the main structure and especially his wonderful work on the divine attributes. So that's why I really love it. Yeah, what do you think of it, Seth? Because I think you've read it.
I mean, I'd say the same things you did. I think it's really unique. I think it is pretty strong in that, like you said, there are kind of 3 routes to get there. And if you get one, you get all 3. And so it proves a lot is the point.
Yes.
Whereas like the contingency argument is a stronger argument, definitely, but it doesn't really prove much.
Yeah. Yeah, contingency arguments, that's like one of the biggest weaknesses of them is they often don't prove way too much. They run into the gap problem a lot. I think that you can overcome it pretty well. I think there's a lot of work that shows it, but like on the face of it, you have to do more work with contingency.
Yeah, the triple primacy argument probably proves more than almost any other classical argument.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Oilers people said, it looks like I need to read Conde. Let me go pull it from, I have it in my books. So I'm going to go grab it. I'll be
He's gone. He's grabbing the book. You guys should watch our arguments for God tier list video. I'll shill our videos in the meantime.
Sorry, what was that, Seth?
I was shilling our arguments for God tier list video.
Ah, yes, yes. Um,
It's in the live
and
stream.
sorry, Nonim, I don't know of any Western scholastics that talk about that Islamic Neoplatonic idea. I don't know of any. I wouldn't be surprised if Aquinas does something with that, or somebody else does, but I just don't know of any. I'm sure some modern Thomists would probably touch it. I'm just not sure of any myself. By the way, this is Nigel Cundy's What is Physics right here. Look at this thing. Look how big this is. So this is the book. For reference, this is now it's admittedly a short book. On the other hand, this is Leia's aphorisms on the New Testament offices and their relationship to the congregation. Look at the difference there. Like, this is Leia. Sorry, this is Leia. This is Cundy. Leia Cundy. Like huge difference there. And the text is tiny. It is tiny. Look at this thing. It's like try to pull this up here. I don't know if you can see it well, but yeah, look at that. It's tiny. Um, it's so amazing though. It is amazing. So let me read the contents of this book. It's like 35 bucks too. This is not some book you're getting for hundreds. I'm gonna look it up right now. Um, you know, I want to say I got it for like 35 or something like that. Um, it's on Amazon. And the best part of it, honestly, is that Kundi like responds to emails. Like I remember I emailed him like I have no clue what you're talking about when you come to time, and he just responded to me within like a day or two. It's amazing. Yeah. This book is I got it for yeah, it's $41 on Amazon currently. But like this book is let me look at this. In turn like ignoring footnotes or not footnotes, the bibliography. It is 742 pages of text this big. Of text this big. Look at that. Look at that. And it's amazing. Let me read the table of contents for you guys. I've honestly been meaning to Kundi on the show. He's so smart. I think he's an Anglican guy. These are so he is a professor of physics. I believe he has his PhD, but he also is a genius in terms of philosophy. These are the chapters and their subsections. Chapter 1, Introduction, which is a long historical discussion of philosophy, and it's so good. That's like one of the best sections of it. It's amazing. Um, Second, chapter 2, Tools. Section 1, Logic. Section 2, Probability. Section 3, the scientific method. I'll just read a random portion of it so you see the quality of this. Here's him talking about tools. Um, Quote, the second consequence of the metaphysics I wish. Oh, no, wait, that's from chapter 1. Sorry. Like, this is just going to show you. One objection to the logical interpretation of probability is that the status of unproved mathematical axioms, such as Goldbach's conjecture that every even number is greater than true than some two prime numbers. We don't know whether this is true or false since it hasn't been proven one way or other. So, on an interpretation where probability is a measure of certainty, with logical interpretation, we should be able to assign a certain probability that isn't 1 or 0 or to it being true. Like it is so dense, it is so amazing, it's so good. The other chapters, try to go quickly here. Then there's metaphysics, section 1, introduction, section 2, assumptions and definitions, chapter 4, Aristotelian metaphysics. And then I'm just going to read the interesting parts of the chapter names. Chapter 5, Aristotelian physics. Chapter 6, emergence of the modern worldview. Chapter 7, classical physics comes to maturity. And in this, he talks about space and time, formalization of mathematics, special relativity, general relativity. That part was beyond me. I don't know this stuff. Uh, the philosophy of classical physics is chapter 8. And that includes space and time. He asks, is the Enlightenment a good thing? And then chapter 9, statistical approaches to physics. Chapter 10, quantum mechanics and field theory. Chapter 11, the philosophical implications of quantum field theory. So some of the questions he asks in here is form and the physics of composite beings, scholastic metaphysics and the quantum field theory. Chapter 12, modern objections to a classical theory of God, where he touches on Hume, Kant, and so on. Chapter 13, a classical theory of God. Then he goes into ethics, theism to physics, and miracles. So he covers like basically everything. And at the end of the book, he's like, yeah, this is just a brief little thing I wrote. There's more to tackle. Maybe someday I'll do it. It's like insane. It's amazing. A lot of it I didn't understand. Like straight up, I wasn't able to read like 2 full chapters of this because I'm not an expert in physics. He's his PhD and he's talking like at PhD level. But his philosophy stuff is like legit too. Like very legit. So yeah, highly recommend it. It's extremely mathematical. So if you like that stuff, you can do it. But he also does philosophy where you don't need math. So it's great. Any thoughts on that, Seth? Sorry, I just rambled.
No, nope.
Okay, the final work in philosophy that I'm recommending. Again, there are so many works I'd recommend, but this is the other one I'd recommend that I really love. Is Paradigm Theory of Existence by William Valicella or Valicella, however you say his name. Best work I've ever read on the essence existence distinction. It is amazing. It's the best work I've ever encountered on it. It's insane. Like, I don't know what to say beyond it's one of my favorite books I've ever read. It's amazing. It's one of the most convincing arguments for um um it's one of the best arguments that I've ever encountered for God's existence. His explanation of it, he engages with other works that are really good. So highly, highly recommend. One of the most influential books I've ever read, and well, most influential to me. Zofnir, you asked if we could buy one book from each of the categories. What would they be? So we have not touched on that, but at the end of the stream, I think we'll go back and I'll say. So summarize it. Anyway, that's it for philosophy for me. Seth, do you have any thoughts?
Nope. I guess I'm in between thoughts while you were gone.
Okay.
That's it.
So now let's get to theology. This should be quicker. Um, so yeah, theology, introductory works. I have bolded, I have 95 Theses by Luther. It's not that this stuff is like his theology later on, because 95 Theses is prior to a lot of his really important stuff in terms of he doesn't fully develop obviously his sola fide and other stuff, but nonetheless, that's the spark, so to speak, of his revolution. Or sorry, the reform, but you know what I mean. So yeah. Any
There's
thoughts on
also a
95
volume
Theses?
in Luther's works on the where he goes to the 95 Theses and explains them.
Oh
Um,
wow.
it's not in the same volume of Luther's works as the 95 Theses appears, but I don't remember which volume it's in, so I'm totally unhelpful. I bet if you
Hmm.
Google it, you'll find it though.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that. That sounds great. I have also Luther's Confession concerning Christ's Supper. This is one of the works where he engages with Zwingli and those who deny the real presence. Pretty solid. I enjoyed it. It's good. Seth, have you read that one?
Yeah, the confession. Yeah, the Great Confession.
Yeah.
The same one. Yeah, yeah. The Great Confession is really good. One of the best exegetical works in terms of like just defending like here are the possible readings you can take. Here's why the Lutheran reading works, and he's arguing against the Reformed readings of his time and saying why they
Hmm.
don't.
Yep. I should also say that a lot of people are going to come. They're like, "Why don't you recommend books XYZ here? Why don't you have this?" These are mostly Lutheran. Like, I'm not going to be putting. There are some Reformed works I actually do recommend, but I wouldn't put them in here because a lot of this for me is like, well, we want to support Lutheranism, so if you want to become a Lutheran scholastic of sorts, this is what I'm trying to say, as opposed to just purely no historical theology. Because otherwise, I'd recommend like Michael Horton's book on justification, Peter Martyr Vermigli's work on original sin, and some other stuff. But for now, I'm just touching on Lutheran stuff and pre Reformation era work. So yeah, and then in bold, I have the is it Loki or Loci Communis, the
Uh,
1520s one from Melanchthon.
yeah, there's a classical versus ecclesiastical Latin,
Yeah. Okay.
some people. There's also like some people pronounce things with anglicized or Germanicized pronunciations. So
Yeah.
whatever works.
Um, but yeah, I say Melanchthon. I said the 1520s one because that's the one that's like earliest and closest to you know the Reformation. It's just really interesting. His later ones are interesting too, but I don't include them just because Chemnitz's Loci Theologici is pretty much a commentary on it, and it's like might as well just read Chemnitz's commentary on it then instead of just reading that and then reading his commentary because he has like the whole text in there. Might as well just buy
Although
as
the
both.
modern edition of the Chemnitz edition does not have all of the 1559 Loki in it because it has some
Oh
sections
really?
omitted. It has those sections where it says just omitted in the table of contents.
Oh, that's right. You're right.
Yeah,
Um,
so it's an incomplete
yeah,
translation of Chemnitz, unfortunately.
yeah, that's rough. But I have the 1520s version of the Loki Communis. Just because I think that one is the most interesting. It's also the easiest one in my mind. It's the
And it's also the
shortest.
one that Luther recommends reading.
Yes, yes. That's why I have it in bold. Next I have Chemnitz's Enchiridion. I think it's just it's a really good introductory work because it's more complex than the Large Catechism, but it's not nearly as complex as some other works. So it's a really good introduction to Lutheran theology in my mind.
Yep.
I have Justification by Matthias Loy. That's a really good work in my mind. A while back, I recorded part of it for the channel, and that's one of the books that, like, if I go back to recording, I'll probably record that one. But, like, it's just been a while. It's a really good book. I recommend it, and it's public domain. Um, John Hutchins asks, "What's the best modern edition of Melanchthon's Lucy?" What's that
Of
one?
which like they're all different. Like the
Yeah,
1521 isn't the same as the 43, which isn't the same as the 35.
yeah. Well, let's assume he's asking about the 1520 for now.
I don't know which one to buy. Couldn't tell
Yeah,
you.
I don't know the individual editions, to be honest, but, like, a lot of them are just solid. Like, there's one popular one that I think, like, the main one that you see if you Google it, I think you should get.
Yeah.
Uh,
There's also still like Melanchthon's at Losi are all different. Like each
yeah,
like edition is like not they're like really different from each other. They're hardly like even like they're all him and they like they are like related to each other, but like they're very different from one another.
yeah. Yeah, no, it's so funny, like, a lot of him like, I remember when I was reading the 1521, the 1521, 1520s version,
Yeah, the
whichever.
1521 is the first one.
Yeah, and, oh, no worries, John, but so, I remember reading it and, like, he has super harsh language in terms of contingency and necessities, like, there's no such thing as, contingency or freedom of the will, and obviously, theological context is different than what we talk about philosophically. He's like, sounds so harsh, like, really harsh, and then later in his, like, 1543, he just, like, walks that back entirely. He's like, "Yeah, let's talk about contingency and freedom of the will." It's like, there are massive changes. No,
Yeah,
but I
there are
have the
huge
1520s
changes.
one because of Luther.
Yeah, 1521 is the classic, and then the 1559 is kind of the other big one.
Yeah.
Uh, and then these CPH printed the 1535 edition, I believe. But I forget if it's labeled as 1535, it's 1543, or it's the other way around. I forget, but they got the year wrong.
Oh, wow. Rip.
So whichever one it's labeled as, if it's 43 or 35, it's whichever one it's not. It's the other one.
Yeah. So I also have and then finally I have Has American Christianity Failed by Wolfmueller. I just recommend it because I think it's actually a fairly good introduction to Lutheran theology. I actually think it's fairly good. Like, I think he makes some good arguments, especially for like infants believing that I haven't really found elsewhere. I just think he does a good job of that. So, and I know he kind of gets some stuff off in terms of like, he kind of he characterizes evangelicalism a little too broadly, but like it's kind of the one critique I have of it, really. Other than that, it's like a
Yeah,
very solid introduction.
I give it a 4 out of 5 stars. It's
Yeah.
yeah, it's like it does a really good job in a lot of things. He like if he had put some clarifying statements at the beginning of the book that were just like he's not like if he had made more clarifying statements about how this doesn't address like all of evangelicalism, like I think that would really help the strength of the book. Because if you go
Yes.
into it, if you're an evangelical and you're reading it, and you go into it as skeptical of the book, of course, um, then you're gonna, especially the first like few chapters, you're probably gonna like think you're just being strawmanned really badly
Yeah.
because he's probably addressing a group that you're not part of.
Yeah. Like the reason I love it so much is because what he critiques is exactly the group I was a part of. But like, other than that, not really strong. Oh, sorry. Other than that, not bad. It's just solid. Um, oh yeah, Zofner, you said his book was uncanny to read through as a Baptist. What do you mean by that? Like, it was really good?
Probably identified things super accurately.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. And that's what I was thinking as an evangelical. Like, he was so good at pointing out a lot of stuff. Like, he has a lecture on has American Christianity failed? Like, he has two, I think, out there on YouTube, and I listen to them every once in a while because they're just so good. Like, that's one of my comfort books. Like, straight up, like that's a book that I'm like, man, if I feel stressed, something, I want to pull that thing out because it's just really comforting. Like, identifies my entire experience. It's amazing. So that's it for the beginner works of theology. Any others you want to recommend, Seth?
Um, One more comment on the Loki edition of
Yeah.
Melanchthon. There's also a 1515 edition, which is
Oh,
out in English. It was his German Loki, not a Latin,
oh wow.
which is unique. It's published by Oxford Press,
Oh
which
wow.
is very different from the other ones too. So
Yeah.
just one more to mention.
Okay. So finally, or not finite, sorry, the intermediate works. This is second to last category. Um, I have the Examination of the Council of Trent by Chemnitz. I've read the whole thing. It's really good. Really, really, really good. I love it. I think the first volume's the best. Like in terms of necessity, like of reading, it kind of goes down by volume. So like first volume, everyone should read. Second volume, very good. You should read it. Third volume, like it's really good. I still think you should. Fourth volume's not as important as the others, but still good. Like all of them are great, but the first volume is where it's like, all right, sola fide, sola scriptura, like and sola gratia, like an original sin as well. Like boom, let's touch it. You know. And the later volumes are like more secondary, so to speak. Not that the issues don't matter. They obviously do, but issues that are less important than like straight soteriology. So recommend all of them. They're amazing. But yeah, how much of them have you read, if any, Seth?
Just more as reference tools than anything else, honestly.
Yeah. Crudeus Homo by Anselm. Yeah, another great work. Great historic work. I really like it.
Yep.
Um, Lord's Supper by Chemnitz. Very good. Because it's another really, really good exegetical work and work of patrology too. Um, so I highly recommend that. I think it's very interesting. I've read through it twice. I really enjoy it both times around. I think he has some of the most interesting analogies with respect to the Eucharist, and he responds to Vermilion there, the Reformed author, which is what's really fascinating. Um, yeah, and Zoffner said that first chapter felt like he was describing his church down to the minutiae. Yeah, I felt that too, man. Felt it too. Yipsia, you say Walther's Law and Gospel. I haven't read it yet. I've read portions, but I haven't read the whole thing yet. I just haven't, man. So I'm not going to put it. I hear good things. I heard some people say it's overrated. I haven't read it, so I can't say. Like, Walther has some good stuff, but I haven't read way too much of him. I used him a lot for my video on Closed Communion. Like his communion theses were really interesting and really good. They're really helpful for that. And then No Name asks any book you would know more about than I would, Seth. Any books on political theology?
Um, there's a volume of that's like an Augustine volume that's like on Augustine's political theology. Um, there's Gerhard's Loki on Urs Locus on the political magistrate, but it's not it's translated but not edited. It won't be published anytime soon.
Have
Um,
doesn't Luther? I'm sure Luther has some political stuff too.
Luther has a lot of stuff. It's kind of scattered throughout other things.
Yeah.
Uh, so I wouldn't, a great actually lecture on that is by Ramirez. If you type in like Ramirez Lutheran resistance theory, he references a lot of works, and you'll
Hmm.
probably be able to kind of the lectures are great, but you'll probably also pick up a lot of works to read on the
Oh,
subject.
yeah.
And Haman, Johann Georg Haman, has stuff if you're interested in counter Enlightenment Lutheran theory.
Yeah. Next, I have the Loki Theologian by Chemnitz. It's very good. I've read most of it. I'm going to be rereading it very soon. Uh, yeah, it's really good. So, have you read that, Seth?
Which one? Sorry.
The Loki Theologian?
The Chemnitz's straight through?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
but lots of sections. Yeah.
Hmm. And then JP Youngkin says Proust was refuted. I'll ask or refuted. I'll ask him during his office hours tomorrow. Oh, you must go to school. That's amazing. Um, yeah, Proust is great. Yeah, I love to see it. I also have Conservative Reformation by Crowth. I have not like I kind of skimmed through the beginning of it just because I'm not as interested in historical like history in terms of theology. I'm obviously very interested in patristics and medieval, but when you get to the actual Reformation, like what goes on, past 1517, I just not really as interested in the history. But when he gets into the exegetical work against like the Reformed, respect the Eucharist and baptism, oh man, it's so good.
Yeah,
Like it's probably
that's
the
a
best
really
work.
great section.
Say that again.
That's a really great section because he's dealing with the more developed Reformed arguments.
Right.
Because we don't have a lot of like the late Scholastic period translated,
Yeah.
and so if you're looking for like someone interacting with later Reformed theology, like more developed Reformed theology, he's kind of the guy.
Yeah, if people ask me where should I go to find like the best arguments for real presence, I say go to Crowth. Um, so I do.
Yeah.
Next, I have Bondage of the Will by Luther. It's important. Um, Babylonian Captivity of the Church by Luther as well. Do you have any thoughts on those?
No, those are
Okay.
essentials.
Yeah. And then Confessional Lutheran Dogmatic series, various. I put them all there just because, like, most of them are at the intermediate level. I really like the one on the Trinity by Beckwith, and then the one on Baptism by Scare. I've been meaning to read the one on Christology as well. So they're pretty good. I would put them at intermediate level. I enjoy them. They're good. They're pretty cheap from what I've seen. So yeah, I recommend those. What do you think, Seth? I think you're the one that recommended these, like on
Yeah,
the
as far
title
as
list.
I mean, as far as like modern Lutheran dogmatics goes, I mean that's the like if you're looking for multi-volume set, that's the set. It's not done yet, but
Yeah.
it's in the works, and you're getting kind of like the most modern Missouri take from like the more conservative side of Missouri,
Yeah.
because there's Nafsker. Nafsker is
Oh
also
gosh.
he has stuff, but he's coming from more of the um he's more influenced by like neo orthodoxy and stuff than we would like. Put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Yipsia says the anthropology volume should be the advanced list. Oh, I'm sure. I just I'm not gonna write every single volume out to be honest with you, but I'm sure one or two of them is gonna slip to the either introductory or advanced. Most of them I have at intermediary or intermediate. Uh, so yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
the
sure.
scale volume on baptism is pretty accessible.
Yeah, that one's very accessible.
Yeah,
I haven't read the anthropology one yet, but I want to. Uh, Theologica Germanica, Anonymous. Seth, you know more about that than I do by far.
yeah. I mean, I would. That's like it's a work that Luther republished. Um, and if you want, like, in my opinion, if you're going to read any work from the late Middle Ages, which is kind of the period after Scotus and Aquinas, but before
Mhm.
the Reformation, kind of, or into the early Reformation is technically like still late medieval period, depending on how you want to count it. But that's like the work to read. Luther, says after Augustine in the Bible, it's the best work he's ever read um,
Yep.
on theology. So it's not terribly difficult to understand. It's something it's in the intermediate level, but it's a mystical work, but not like weird mystical necessarily. Not like some of the other guys from that era, like Merswin. If you
Mhm.
know, not that anyone knows who Merswin is, um, but it's more like a philosophical meditation coming from like Neoplatonist perspective on God, and it has a lot of stuff that resonates with Lutheran theology, um, and so that's hence why Luther, liked it so much, and Calvin hated it. So do with that what you
Oh,
will.
base.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Calvin hates it and Luther loves it. So
Yeah, that's good. JP Youngkin asks, in his earlier work, oh, sorry, he asks about Augustine. He says he's been looking into Augustine, respect to concupiscence as sin. It seems that in his earlier works, he indicates first order concupiscence is analogous to sin, but isn't sin itself. I
wait,
can't speak as much to his
we
earlier
have a
works.
comment on that. We have
Sorry?
if you go look at our video on
Yes.
involuntary sins, and then
Yep.
check the comments, and we address this specifically in a comment.
Yeah,
We have
that's right. I
a
remember
really
that
long
video.
write up on it.
Yeah, yeah, we addressed that exact thing in one of our videos, like the comment section on involuntary sins. One of the things to remember with any church father is like, yeah, you're gonna find contradictions because like thought develops over time. Like we tend to think, unfortunately, of theologians as these absolutely like set individuals. Like, oh yeah, they believe this. Like, well, thoughts change. If you're to look at me and ask me, hey, what did you believe 5 years ago? Man, I'm gonna be saying different stuff than right now. Um, and Augustine's the same way. I mean, he writes a whole book, Retractions on retracting statements. But like when you read, especially when you read against Julian, Augustine's insanely clear. I mean, he literally says to Julian, he's like, "You admit that concupiscence is a disease, or no, sorry, you say that concupiscence needs a cure, but you won't say it's a disease. This makes no sense. Concupiscence is obviously sin." That's what he says to Julian. So I think that work is outside of public domain. I think I got it from the library, but like it's legit. Like that's where he really shows it. So yeah, Augustine's gonna contradict himself in places, as does Luther, as does Gerhard, as do various other figures. Augustine will contradict himself, and so the point of using Augustine in that respect, and church fathers in the respect where, with respect to, you know, any church father really is just they're going to disagree with themselves, but frankly, if you see one of their like, if you at least see your beliefs in there, that kind of indicates something at the very least. Like people change their theologies. That's just what happens. They're convinced one way or another, but like Augustine's never condemned for thinking, concupiscence is sin, and I think he does it by the end of it. So yeah. Yeah, no name with respect to this guy saying that he, you know, responds to PSR. I mean, he just says he's refuted it. He doesn't like you'd have to actually see what the argument is because I've seen people that are like, yeah, here's a obvious, refute of um there's an obvious refutation of the fact that God doesn't or that God exists. And then I look at him like, this isn't an argument at all. This is trash. So yeah, and JP Young said he saw our video and started to parse some of the quotes. Brief parsing shows that concupiscence doesn't possess guilt, rather has guilt attached to it. Um well, in his quotes, I mean, like one of the quotes I have in there, he just says, "Yeah, this is sinful. Like this is obviously sin." Um, and some of his other quotes in there, like what he says, and this is quoted in the apology, is that when we have concupiscence after baptism, it's not imputed to us. That's just what Augustine straight up says. So there are going to be quotes you'll read from Augustine where it's like, oh, he says it's not sinful. What he later says more clearly is he says, yeah, because it's not imputed insofar as you are Christian, because you have been saved.
Yep,
But in his
exactly.
actual, like, again, if you want to read through where Augustine is going to talk about this most, find against Julian. That is so clear. Like I said in the video, hey, I could put more quotes in here, but just read the whole against Julian. Like it's several chapters or him just being like, this is sin. This is sin. This is sin. Julian, you say it's not. It's obvious that it is. Like that work is so insanely clear on it that if you're going to read anything on Augustine that would indicate it is sin, then it's the one to read. My video doesn't have all the quotes by any means. I looked through that book. Oh my gosh, I found at least 50 quotes that indicated. I just put what I thought were some of the interesting ones. So yeah, what were you gonna say, Seth?
I was gonna say just to reference the comment again, because some of the details on how Augustine's defining things is important.
Oh yeah.
The comment we had on the video that asks a question about this that we respond to.
Yeah, because like Augustine will use language again, like people will bring up, oh, well, Augustine says it's not sin for the Christian, such that it's like the Roman Catholic view that concupiscence is or sorry, I just kind of lost my train of thought straight up. It's kind of like the Roman Catholic view where, it's guilty it's like guilty by a kind of figure of speech. It's not actually guilty because it brings forth that kind of sin. Like some people will argue that from some of his quotes where he says it's no longer guilty in the Christian, but he clarifies it's not an imputation. Um, so yeah. And then with respect to Euler, yeah, I have not seen anything on Augustine retracting his statements about concupiscence anywhere. Like I've not seen that. Um, I've not read his retractions. I've read portions of it, but like I've not seen anything from his retractions that say he doesn't believe concupiscence is sin or that he retracts it. I mean, I could be wrong, but like when I was doing my research for it and looking into Augustine on it, like I didn't find anywhere where someone says, "Hey, go read his retractions and see that he denies concupiscence as sinful." So yeah, I literally just Googled like this is quick. I know it's not immediate here. Um, I know it's not an immediate and obvious, you know, search, so to speak, or find. But I literally looked up retractions Augustine concupiscence, and I'm not finding anything where it's like, yeah, Augustine, retracts it. Augustine says it's wrong. Uh, yeah, I haven't seen anything that indicates that he does. Um, I'd have to see. So yeah, Youngkin, I'd have to read that from Aquinas. You say that he asks in part, in the Summa, question 82 with respect to concupiscence. So I'd have to look. I just straight haven't seen that yet. So, but I do recall. Like, let me look into it. Actually, I'm curious. I'm actually super curious. So that's part one. Um, said it's question 82, something like that. Yeah, original sin. I found this. Um, let's see. Yeah, I know. He just quotes. He actually just quotes Augustine, the retraction, saying that concupiscence is the guilt of original sin. That's just in his retractions. It's a cute. Yeah, that it is the guilt of original sin. Because we would say that it is. Seth, am I wrong on that? Would we say that it's part of the guilt? Like it is a punishment and it's the guilt.
Yeah, I think so.
I could be wrong in that. I think that's the language we'd use,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't be surprised if like there's this different definition that Augustine's using there. I don't know, but I don't see anything like there's nothing in that statement that immediately I'm thinking like, oh, that's awful. Like that's something that we would deny. I don't see anything there with it. And I
Right.
did now that I think I did read it back when I was responding to Rome on it, and I read that and I didn't think there were any issues with it. So I don't know. All right, sorry about that. We're moving forward. Unio Mystica by Timothy Schmeling as well. That's a good one. I really like that one a lot. Um, Seth, you recommended that one to me. I remember. I really liked it.
Yeah, it was his MDiv thesis.
Yep. I
I
have
gotta get going in
conversion.
a minute, by the way.
Yeah, that's fine. We're almost done. I have Conversion and Election by Pieper. I thought that was enjoyable. It's an intermediate work. I mean, it's all right. It's more so like it's not the most interesting read, but it's enjoyable, and I think it's important to read for the sake of understanding like where the Missouri Synod develops, and even though just not even the Missouri Synod, but Lutheranism in America develops with respect to Intuitu Fidei. Um, so yeah, and then obviously Atonement in Lutheran Orthodoxy, Quenstedt. I put that in intermediate works. Super dry, but still good work. Yeah. Seth, you want to just kind of, do you have anything else, or do you want me to just continue on the advanced works? There are only like 5.
You can just continue. Those are all good.
Okay, in bold, I just straight up have all of Gerhard's theological commonplaces. I just have all of them. I mean, they're pretty much all advanced. Like some are more accessible than others, but like still, some are more accessible than others. But they're all pretty advanced. They deal in one of the greatest ways I've ever encountered in theology. Just it's amazing. Two Natures in Christ by Chemnitz. Yeah, that's his best work. It's amazing to me. I've read it. I think I've read through it like twice, and it's just so good. He makes some amazing arguments for the genus Maestaticum. Um, and then Doctrinal Theology of Lutheran Church by Heinrich Schmidt. I have it in a T again. It's just Schmid. Schmidt. Um, yeah, this work is really good because I mean, I wouldn't. It's kind of more a reference work than just read straight through, but it basically has a bunch of stuff that's otherwise untranslated. So I love it. Um, yeah, and it's free online. And then finally, the last two, Christian Dogmatics by Pieper. That's the one that the LCMS seminarians use. That's what seminarians and LCMS have to read volumes 1, 2, 3. And so it's pretty much the standard of what people are being taught, and it's very good. The only thing I don't like about Pieper, and that works, like I just wish he dealt more with the patristics. Like he does such a good job dealing with our own Lutheran fathers and with scripture, but like he doesn't touch the patristics, and it's like the saddest thing in the world to me. I wish he did. Finally, Adorable and Venerable Eucharist by Hart. It's very good. I put it in advance because he deals a lot with like quantity as a category. And it gets very complex with respect to the philosophical stuff, but overall it is theological. So yeah. Any final thoughts, Seth? There was one person who said the final thing we should do is say what we would read from all of these, from each category,
Or
just like one book.
just one. Okay.
Yeah.
No, let's do that.
Patristics,
Well,
I would say on the incarnation.
I think Confessions, just because it's so famous.
That's fair. Introductory works of philosophy, I would probably say Scholastic Metaphysics.
Yeah.
Intermediate philosophical works, I would say Treatise on the One God.
Yeah. I don't have a comment on this one.
That's okay. Advanced, I don't think you have I mean, I don't know if you have a comment on this
No.
one. I would say What is Physics? That one's just so good. Like, yeah, $40 too. So. And then
This one, Loci Communes.
agreed. And then I would say either the Conservative Reformation or Loci Theologici. I would probably say Loci Theologici.
That's a hard call.
It's a really hard call.
Actually, I think Conservative Reformation, just because if you're only going to read just because it has so much history stuff in it about kind of covering like the history of the Reformation and also the attitude that Lutheran Reformation took.
That's fair. And then finally, this last one. I mean, it's kind of unfair to say theological commonplaces because that's all of them. But like, I would actually let's just say there's like one of them, the best of them. I would probably say Two Natures in Christ, actually. I think
Yeah, I
Father
don't know.
Father Braden himself, the arch theologian of our day, whose questions are or sorry, his whose answers are practically mystical at this point. Uh, he has like I affirm double truth, but it just has to do with Father Braden's answers. I would say Two Nature, but he says because he says that Two Nature is probably the greatest Christological work ever written. I would just straight up agree.
Yeah, I don't know. Hard call there. I
Yep.
like Gerhard more just because of his although Two Natures is really well laid out. It's really well organized.
So
I don't know.
yeah. Well, anyway, that's the stream. I'm going to guys tonight. I'll put in links to all of these, and I'll put it on the description of the video. So thanks for watching. I'm gonna head out. It's great seeing you guys. I learned a lot from the comments. So bye.